It began with the deep growl of engines beneath the North Atlantic, a sound that carried both pride and doom. In the spring of 1941, the pride of the German Kriegsmarine, the battleship Bismarck, prepared to sail, towering over the waves like a steel mountain, armed with 8 massive 15-inch guns and armored like no ship before her. The Bismarck was more than just a warship. She was a symbol. To Germany, she represented power, vengeance, and defiance against the Royal Navy that had ruled the seas for centuries. Her mission, known as Operation Rheinübung, would be her first voyage and her last. This was not just another naval operation. It was a statement to the world. Germany's plan was simple: to break into the Atlantic, join with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and wreak havoc on Allied convoys bringing vital supplies to Britain. If successful, Bismarck could strangle Britain's lifeline, turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. But from the moment she slipped out of her Norwegian fjord under the veil of fog, she was being hunted. British intelligence had intercepted her departure. The Royal Navy, driven by both fear and pride, launched one of the greatest sea chases in history. The voyage of the Bismarck would unfold like a naval epic, a story of daring, tragedy, and the brutal beauty of war at sea. On May 24th, 1941, in the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, Bismarck met the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of Britain, a legend of the Great War. What followed was a clash of giants. Within minutes, a shell from Bismarck found Hood's magazine. In a single blinding flash, Britain's greatest warship exploded and vanished beneath the sea, taking more than 1,400 men with her. Only 3 survived. The shockwave reverberated through the Royal Navy and the British nation. The order from Prime Minister Winston Churchill was simple: sink the Bismarck. And so began one of the most relentless hunts in naval history. From the icy fjords of Norway to the vast grey Atlantic, dozens of British ships, submarines and aircraft closed in. The hunted ship became a legend, dodging pursuit, leaking fuel, yet still defiant. For 3 days the Royal Navy searched the endless ocean, desperate for revenge, until, on May 26th, a Catalina patrol aircraft spotted her, wounded, alone, and running for safety. What followed was a crescendo of vengeance. British torpedo bombers from HMS Royal struck in the storm, one torpedo jamming Bismarck's rudder and sealing her fate. As dawn rose on May 27th, 1941, the Royal Navy closed in. Battleships King George V and Rodney unleashed a storm of fire. For over an hour the Atlantic roared as shells ripped into Bismarck's hull, tearing away her superstructure, silencing her guns one by one. Her crew, brave to the last, fought amid fire and ruin. At 10:39 a.m., the proud giant began to roll, her flag still flying. In moments she was gone, swallowed by the cold Atlantic, taking over 2,000 souls with her. Her first mission had become her final voyage. But the sinking of the Bismarck was not just the end of a ship, it was the end of an era. Her destruction proved that even the mightiest battleship was no match for air power, technology, and relentless determination. The age of the great guns had begun to fade, replaced by aircraft carriers and submarines. Yet the legend of Bismarck endured, a symbol of courage, tragedy, and the unforgiving nature of war at sea. Tonight we'll relive every moment of Operation Rheinübung, from the secret departure in Norway to the thunderous clash in the Denmark Strait, and finally the dramatic hunt across the Atlantic. We'll explore the men aboard, their hopes, their fears, and their final hours aboard a ship that defied the odds until her last breath. So before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you? as we sail into one of the most dramatic naval sagas of World War II, a story of pride, pursuit and destruction upon the open sea. This is the entire history of Operation Rheinübung, the Bismarck's first and final voyage. In the cold twilight of post-war Germany, when hunger gnawed and factories stood silent, a dream of steel began to stir again. The Treaty of Versailles had left the Reich's navy, shackled, its ambitions scattered like rust across abandoned slips. Yet beneath the grey waters of Kiel whispers of defiance lingered, engineers sketching in secrecy, imagining what was forbidden. The docks smelled of oil and brine, of effort reborn through quiet rebellion. Welders worked in long shadows, sparks cascading like captured lightning. Every hammer strike was both defiance and prayer, echoing against the steel skeletons of unfinished ships. Above them, cranes swung slowly through the fog, as if awakening giants from sleep. In these shipyards, Germany's pride found form not in speeches but in steel plates bolted one upon another. The sea, indifferent and waiting, seemed to hold its breath. From silence, a colossus began to rise. The Bismarck was not merely a battleship. She was redemption forged in metal. Her blueprints spanned entire tables, detailed in precise ink strokes that blended art and mathematics. Naval architects studied each line with reverence, knowing every curve carried meaning beyond mechanics. Her hull would stretch over 250 meters, displacing more than 50,000 tons when fully loaded. Deep within the design lay a philosophy, resilience disguised as beauty. The air inside the drawing rooms was heavy with pipe smoke, murmured debate, and the ticking of clocks marking history's return. Outside, the hum of welders never ceased, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through winter air. Riveters' hammers sang against steel, each strike sending tremors through frozen ground. The scent of molten metal clung to clothing and skin like a medal earned through labor. Slowly, a nation's silence began to take the shape of power. In the shipyard, men worked 12-hour shifts beneath floodlights that painted the night in silver and flame. Sparks rained from scaffolds like artificial stars, lighting faces streaked with sweat and soot. The clang of metal became a kind of music, relentless, rhythmic, unyielding. Foremen shouted commands over the roar of engines, their voices carried away by the Baltic wind. Young apprentices hauled rivets in burlap sacks, their fingers raw, their eyes filled with pride. The sound of progress was deafening, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something quieter, belief. To many, the Bismarck was not just a ship, but vindication, the proof that Germany's heart still beat. Even the sea, lapping softly at the pier, seemed to pulse in rhythm with the work. As dawn broke over the cranes, the skeleton of the great vessel glowed red from the fires within. Hope had found its furnace. The Rice leaders visited often, their polished boots glinting beneath the industrial haze. Admirals traced fingers along cold girders, imagining the thunder this ship would one day unleash. Reporters scribbled notes, describing her as a floating fortress, a symbol of renewal, a monument to the new Germany. Propaganda posters soon appeared, showing the Bismarck cutting through blue waters beneath a rising sun. Yet among the shipwrights, pride mixed with unease. They knew that glory, when cast in steel, was also burden. One whispered, "She will bring honor, but at a cost we cannot yet see." His words vanished beneath the roar of cranes lifting another armor plate into place. Each plate was 3 inches thick, each bolt tightened with ritual precision. Even as the nation celebrated her birth, the shadows of the next war were already moving across Europe. The ship's greatness carried within it the seeds of its doom. Inside her frame, the corridors began to take shape, a labyrinth of rivets, pipes, and dreams. The smell of paint filled the air, sharp and chemical, coating the raw steel in armor's first skin. Electric lights flickered to life for the first time, revealing a cathedral of industry stretching from bow to stern. Technicians tested engines that groaned and thundered like awakening beasts. Their vibrations rolled through the decks, a deep mechanical heartbeat that shook the scaffolding. In the mess hall, workers wiped oil from their hands and spoke quietly of her speed, her strength, her promise. The hum of machinery never stopped, even through the night. The sound carried across the harbour, mingling with the cries of gulls and the whisper of waves. Each vibration became a promise of vengeance, of prestige, of purpose. Beneath the moonlight, the Bismarck was already alive. By 1939, her hull dominated the skyline, a mountain of grey steel surrounded by scaffolds like ribs around a living thing. Painters hung suspended from ropes, their brushes tracing lines of camouflage designed to confuse enemy eyes. Naval officers inspected gun turrets larger than houses, each capable of hurling a shell the weight of a car across 20 miles. The workers paused at times to admire the symmetry of their creation, marveling at its precision and grace. In their exhaustion, pride was its own fuel. The Bismarck's launch date loomed like a festival and a funeral in one. Bands rehearsed, photographers prepared, dignitaries planned their speeches. Even the city seemed to vibrate with expectation. When a gust of wind rattled the flags atop the cranes, one engineer looked up and murmured, "She's impatient." The sea, too, seemed to stir in anticipation of its newest queen. On a crisp February morning, the shipyard gathered in solemn celebration. Thousands stood along the pier, bundled in coats, breath steaming in the cold. A brass band's music echoed across the harbour, slow and stately. Dorothea von Loewenfeld stepped forward, the champagne bottle trembling slightly in her gloved hand. The crowd fell silent as she struck it against the ship's bow, christening her Bismarck in the name of Germany's Iron Chancellor and of history itself. The bottle shattered, and for a heartbeat nothing moved. Then the great hull began to slide into the water, her bulk groaning like a continent set adrift. The crowd erupted in cheers, hats thrown skyward, flags waving like bursts of colour in the grey. Water surged, foaming white beneath her as she settled into her element for the first time. The Baltic welcomed her with a shudder that felt like prophecy. As she floated free, sunlight broke through the clouds and struck her flanks, turning grey steel to gold. Cameras flashed, capturing the glint of wet metal and the awe on every face. Reporters wrote of triumph, of rebirth, of destiny fulfilled. Admirals smiled for photographs, their expressions polished but proud. Somewhere beneath the pomp, however, stood the workers, silent, exhausted, their hands raw from months of labour. They watched her drift, knowing their fingerprints would forever be pressed into her hull. Some crossed themselves, others simply nodded, acknowledging what they had unleashed. The sea lapped against her sides, testing her weight, her strength, her will. She passed the test in silence, and in that silence history seemed to pause, aware that something immense had just begun to move. When night fell, the shipyard lights burned long after the ceremony had ended. Engineers inspected every weld, every gauge, every joint, as if unwilling to trust sleep with something so magnificent. The air smelled of salt and machine oil, thick with pride and fatigue. From a distance, the Bismarck loomed like a city of her own, vast, mysterious, alive in the moonlight. The harbour was still, broken only by the occasional clang of a chain or the ripple of tide against hull. In nearby homes, the workers' families spoke of her as though she were a person, a guardian, a symbol. Children pointed from their windows toward the faint outline rising above the cranes. "That's our ship," one whispered, as if claiming a piece of destiny. The Bismarck rested now, but only in body. In spirit, she was already moving toward history's horizon. In the years to come, her name would echo across oceans, her story told in awe and sorrow. But on that night, she was only promise, untouched by war, unstained by death. Her decks gleamed, her engines silent, her guns at rest beneath canvas. The sea outside her berth was calm, reflecting the first stars of evening. Somewhere beyond those stars, fate was already writing her final coordinates. The men who built her would never forget the way she looked that night, proud, perfect, and impossibly alive. In her stillness lay both triumph and tragedy, waiting to be awakened. The Bismarck was no longer a project. She was prophecy made steel, and as the wind whispered through her rigging, the sound was almost human. In a world rebuilding from ruin, they forged a monument to power, a ship that would carry both pride and prophecy. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endless and grey, a vast living wilderness of wind and salt. Beneath its heaving waves lay the arteries of empire, the shipping lanes that kept Britain breathing. Every tanker, every merchantman carried not just cargo but survival itself, food, oil, and ammunition for a nation standing alone. In 1941, those lanes became battlefields without borders. Convoys crept through fog, their decks rimmed with ice, their crews listening for sounds that did not belong. The echo of a diesel engine, the hiss of a periscope cutting through waves. At night, the ocean seemed alive with whispers of danger, invisible yet close. Above, the northern lights flickered faintly over a horizon of steel and fear. Men stood at their stations, eyes straining against the dark, knowing death could come from beneath. Every mile was contested, every crossing an act of defiance. The Atlantic had become not a route, but a gamble with fate. Deep beneath those same waters, the hunters waited. German U-boats prowled in silence, their hulls slick with condensation, the air thick with oil and sweat. Inside, red lights glowed dimly, casting faces in tones of blood and shadow. The men spoke in whispers, their breath frosting the steel walls of their narrow world. Diesel fumes mixed with the constant vibration of engines, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. The commander, peering through his periscope, saw not the ocean but opportunity. Slow, heavy convoys crawling through the fog above. He raised a hand and the crew fell silent. Valves hissed, torpedoes armed. The war beneath the sea had begun long before the world above could grasp its scale. In that underwater silence, the Reich's new strategy moved unseen. From Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz directed his wolf packs with precision that bordered on obsession. Maps covered the walls of his operations room. The Atlantic stretched wide across them like a patient under surgery. Thin black lines marked convoy routes, red pins signified kills. Cigarette smoke coiled through the air, mingling with the low murmur of radios reporting distant victories. "They are the merchants of death," Dönitz told his staff, "and we will starve them where they sail." His officers nodded, their faces gaunt from long nights, their faith in tonnage figures and efficiency charts. Each success was measured not in lives but in tons sunk. 10,000 here, 30,000 there. Each number another wound to Britain's lifeline. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows of the Reich Naval Command. Inside, men believed they were building a strategy that could suffocate an empire. The ocean itself had become their ally, vast, cold, and merciless. Across the sea, in London's underground war rooms, Winston Churchill studied reports that seemed written in grief. Sheets of paper carried statistics that bled into tragedy. Ships sunk, men missing, cargo lost. Each line represented another family's silence, another ship swallowed by grey oblivion. The Battle of the Atlantic, he called it, a struggle that would determine whether Britain lived or died. Around him, his naval advisers argued softly under the dim yellow glow of bunker lamps. Their maps glistened with pinholes and fingerprints, evidence of sleepless vigilance. Coffee cups sat cold on tables beside ashtrays, overflowing with war's insomnia. "Find them," Churchill murmured, "and destroy them before they destroy us." The words hung in the air like smoke. Above ground, the city trembled under the drone of distant bombers, but here, beneath London's heart, another kind of war was being fought, one without front lines, only consequences. At sea, the convoy system became Britain's answer to the invisible war. Merchant ships formed in tight formation, guarded by destroyers that zigzagged through the swells, like shepherds protecting a wounded flock. The ocean howled around them, waves crashing against hulls with bone-shaking force. Men stood at guns slick with salt spray, scanning the horizon where fog met fear. Every echo, every ripple in the water felt like an omen. The night sky was starless, the soundscape dominated by the groan of steel and the moan of wind through rigging. Inside the bridge, captains watched the compass swing, counting miles as though counting prayers. When U-boats struck, the explosions came without warning, sudden flowers of flame blooming from the sea. Ships vanished in minutes, swallowed by the cold. The survivors floated among debris, their cries carried by wind that no one answered. The ocean gave nothing back. Far to the north, aircraft of Coastal Command flew endless patrols over waters that stretched beyond imagination. The pilots, wrapped in fur-lined jackets, peered through ice-rimmed canopies into an infinity of grey. They searched for shadows beneath the waves, for the thin oil slicks that betrayed the presence of predators. Below, convoys moved like constellations of light, each ship's lantern a fragile star in the dark void. The Atlantic offered no mercy, only endurance. Storms lashed the plains, driving sleet across their wings, freezing the very breath of the men inside. Engines sputtered, radios crackled, and compasses drifted off course. Yet still they flew, hour after hour, because to stop meant surrender. In that sky, courage was measured not in victory but in persistence. The war was fought in silence, between cloud and sea, between hope and inevitability. For Germany, the early months brought triumph. Convoy after convoy was struck, and reports to Berlin read like hunting logs of an empire undone. Propaganda celebrated the U-boat crews as heroes of a new kind of war, young, fearless, and unrelenting. Families in Hamburg and Bremen gathered around radios, listening to bulletins of ships sunk in the North Atlantic. Yet beneath the jubilation lay the quiet toll of exhaustion and loss. For every victory, a submarine might not return. Mothers waited in silence for telegrams that never came. The Atlantic, even to its conquerors, demanded sacrifice. Deep within its dark belly, men stared at bulkheads and wondered if the ocean would remember them at all. The U-boat war was not fought for glory. It was fought in shadows, unseen, unheard, and unending. The British adapted, as Britain always had. New technologies whispered their way into the struggle. Radar sets humming in darkness. Sonar pings echoing like heartbeats through black water. In secret laboratories, scientists bent light and sound into weapons of survival. On destroyers, young officers listened through headphones, deciphering the ocean's language in patterns of static and silence. Convoys began to strike back. Slowly but surely, U-boats that once stalked freely now found themselves hunted. Searchlights pierced the fog, and depth charges rolled from rails into the sea, their detonations shaking the night like thunder. The hunters were learning to fear the hunted. The war beneath the waves was evolving, and with it the stakes of history itself. What began as strategy was turning into endurance, a test of which side could hold its breath longer beneath the weight of the Atlantic. By spring of 1941, both sides understood the truth. Control of the Atlantic was control of the future. The sea connected continents, sustained armies and fed nations. If Britain's lifelines broke, Europe would fall silent under the boots of tyranny. But if those lines held, if the convoys endured, then hope would continue to flow west to east like invisible blood. From Newfoundland to Iceland, from Scapa Flow to Brest, ships moved in endless procession, prey and predator, bound in rhythm. The cold, relentless waves erased distinctions between victory and loss, between the living and the missing. The ocean had become the great equalizer, indifferent to cause or creed. Every sunrise revealed wreckage drifting beside the living, reminders that survival was temporary. The battle was not won in fire, but in persistence, in refusing to sink. And so the war dragged on, measured in tonnage, in courage, in silence. In both Berlin and London, men stared at the same maps and saw the same truth, that the Atlantic was no longer merely water, but destiny. It stretched like a wound between continents, pulsing with life and death in equal measure. Ships still sailed, submarines still stalked, and the sea still claimed its toll with unwavering hunger. In every direction it whispered of possibility and peril. The struggle for its command was not yet decided, but its importance was absolute. To lose it was to lose everything. Even the stars above seemed to flicker with anticipation, their light swallowed by the endless mist of war. The sea had become the silent judge of empires, weighing courage against cruelty, endurance against arrogance. And as the waves rolled on beneath the moon, one truth became clear. The Atlantic was no longer a sea of trade, it had become the lungs of empire, and both sides knew how easily it could be suffocated. In the spring of 1941, aboard the Baltic's grey waters, two men prepared to carry the weight of a nation's ambitions across an unforgiving sea, Admiral Günther Lütjens and Captain Ernst Lindemann, names soon to be bound together by fate and by fire. The Bismarck rested silent at anchor, her decks glistening with morning dew, her crew awaiting orders that would send them into legend. In her shadow, officers moved with quiet efficiency, unaware of how brief their journey would be. Inside the Admiral's quarters, the air was thick with tobacco and tension. Maps were spread across the table, their edges curling beneath the flickering lamplight. Red pencil marks traced routes through the North Sea, toward the storming heart of the Atlantic. Lütjens studied them in silence, a man of precision, not passion. His eyes reflected not excitement, but inevitability. The mission was no longer a choice, it was destiny clothed in duty. Admiral Günther Lütjens was a man of restraint, his calm presence both admired and misunderstood. He wore his uniform like armor, crisp and immaculate, concealing the turmoil of responsibility beneath. His manner was measured, his voice low, every word deliberate. Among his officers, he was respected but not loved, a man of logic in a war driven by emotion. His loyalty to the Kriegsmarine was absolute, but his allegiance to Hitler was distant, almost reluctant. He saw the coming voyage not as glory but as necessity, the execution of a plan forged by others far from the sea. Behind closed doors, he admitted to a colleague that he did not believe this war could be won, yet he would fight it with discipline, as he had been trained to do. His orders were clear, and his conscience quiet. For Lütjens, obedience was the last virtue left in a world unravelling. Captain Ernst Lindemann, by contrast, carried the ocean in his heart. A sailor since his youth, he felt the rhythm of waves as naturally as breath. Where Lütjens commanded through intellect, Lindemann led through presence, firm, composed, and quietly human. He walked the decks of his ship each morning before sunrise, his boots echoing softly through the mist. The crew respected him deeply, for he knew their work, their fears, and their pride. He would pause at the bow, gazing out into the horizon where dawn met the cold line of the sea. His face bore the calm of a man who understood both the beauty and cruelty of his element. In his cabin hung a single photograph, his wife and daughter smiling beneath a summer sky untouched by war. Sometimes he would touch the frame lightly, then turn away. Duty called louder than memory. In the officers' mess, conversation drifted like the smoke from their cigarettes, subdued, uncertain, waiting for direction. Lutyens and Lindemann sat apart, their silences speaking different languages. Between them stretched the thin, invisible thread of command, one bound to strategy, the other to stewardship. Outside, the Bismarck's engines rumbled in low readiness, a mechanical pulse waiting for purpose. Officers reviewed charts while radio operators tested frequencies through static-filled air. The war had already taken Europe, but now it demanded dominion over the sea. The Bismarck was its weapon, and these men its will. Every decision made here would ripple outward, unseen, until it struck the shores of history itself. For now they drank their coffee in silence, listening to the hum of the ship like the heartbeat of destiny. In that stillness, the weight of command was almost unbearable. Lutyen's reputation preceded him, a veteran of Norway, a tactician shaped by experience and loss. He had watched ships burn in Narvik's frozen waters, seen men die beneath the indifferent eyes of ice. Those memories returned now, unbidden, as he studied the Atlantic chart one final time. He knew that Britain's navy was vast, its response swift, its pride wounded. The mission Operation Rheinübung demanded boldness, a raid into the heart of Allied supply routes, with little chance of retreat. He calculated the risks with mathematical precision, his pencil tapping softly against the map's edge. His staff waited for orders, unwilling to interrupt his quiet concentration. "We will proceed," he finally said, voice calm, almost resigned. It was not bravado, but obligation. Outside, thunder rolled over the Baltic, as if echoing the thought he would not voice aloud. This voyage would end only one way. Lindemann, meanwhile, inspected his crew with the eye of a father rather than a commander. He stopped to exchange brief words with gunners, engineers, and signalmen. Each man part of a living organism he understood intimately. "Keep her steady," he said to one young helmsman, patting his shoulder. His tone was quiet but carried weight, the kind that steadies rather than commands. Below decks, sailors worked amid the smell of oil and iron, their laughter faint, forced, fading. They polished brass and tightened bolts, more for distraction than necessity. The Bismarck's corridors hummed with readiness, the ship itself seeming to breathe. Lindemann paused near the main battery, his hand resting against the cold steel of one of her massive guns. "She will defend herself," he murmured, though perhaps it was himself he meant to reassure. Outside, gulls circled above the masts, indifferent to what awaited them at sea. In private moments, both men wrestled with thoughts they could never confess aloud. Lutyens wrote letters to his wife, though he doubted they would reach her. His handwriting was precise, his words restrained, expressions of calm that masked unease. "We serve as we must," he wrote. "Whatever follows, remember that I remained faithful to my duty." Lindemann's journal entries were simpler, almost poetic, reflections on weather and crew morale, as if describing a voyage rather than a campaign. Yet between the lines, his awareness of fate bled through. Both men knew that once they sailed, they would vanish into an ocean ruled by uncertainty. Above all, they shared the knowledge that history rarely spares those who command greatness. They were men entrusted with legend, not survival, and in that burden lay a truth heavier than armor. The night before departure, The officers gathered one final time beneath low lights and low voices. The room smelled of coffee, leather, and quiet apprehension. Outside, rain pattered softly on steel, mingling with the faint hum of generators. Lutjens spoke briefly, his words more duty than inspiration. "We sail to fulfill our orders," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." Lindemann added nothing. He simply nodded, his expression steady, his silence enough. The men dispersed slowly, each returning to his post as if to ritual. In the Admiral's cabin, the map of the North Atlantic lay open like an unrolled prophecy. Its blue expanse stretched toward destiny, vast, merciless, and irresistible. The storm they would soon enter was not only meteorological but moral. As dawn broke, the crew assembled along the deck, the wind cutting sharp across the water. The sea smelled of salt and distance, of journeys not yet begun. Orders were shouted, lines cast off, engines rumbled awake beneath their feet. The Bismarck moved slowly from her berth, her great hull displacing water in solemn ceremony. Lutjens stood on the bridge, face unreadable, his cap brim shadowing his eyes. Lindemann watched beside him, his hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed ahead. Together they appeared like twin statues carved from resolve, opposites, bound by purpose. The ship gathered speed, her wake spreading wide, her engines thundering with restrained might. As the coastline faded behind them, both men knew they were crossing more than geography. They were crossing into history. The Baltic faded into mist, the land shrinking to memory. The crew settled into rhythm, each man performing his role as if to music composed by fate. Below decks, the heartbeat of engines echoed like prophecy fulfilled. On the bridge, Lutjens and Lindemann exchanged a final glance, not of camaraderie but of understanding. They knew what awaited them beyond the horizon: pursuit, battle, and the cold arithmetic of war. Yet neither faltered, for both believed in something greater than survival, in the duty of men chosen by circumstance to play their part. Above them, gulls wheeled and vanished into the fog, leaving only the sound of the sea. The Bismarck's bow cut forward, indifferent to what it pierced. Somewhere ahead lay glory, somewhere beyond silence. They sailed not for conquest, but conviction, men bound to orders they would never return from. The dawn of May 19th, 1941, came pale and cold over the harbour of Gotenhofen. Fog hung thick over the water, muffling sound and blurring the outlines of giants at rest. Beneath that shroud of secrecy, the battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen waited, their hulls gleaming faintly with condensation. The air was sharp with the smell of oil and salt, the taste of anticipation heavy on every breath. On deck, sailors moved in hushed coordination, boots echoing softly against steel. Engines hummed below, deep and restrained, like a beast chained beneath the surface. Signals flashed between ships in coded light, brief, silent confirmations of readiness. Officers checked watches, their faces expressionless beneath their caps. Across the harbour, a faint band tune drifted through the mist, slow, solemn, and fleeting. The moment had arrived, and history held its breath. From the quayside, workers' and officers' families stood in quiet clusters, their coats drawn tight against the Baltic wind. Some waved small flags, others merely watched, faces obscured by fog and emotion. The low hum of machinery carried across the water, mingling with the distant toll of a ship's bell. Prinz Eugen began to move first, her bow slicing through the still water with the grace of inevitability. Tugboats guided her slowly, their whistles faint in the morning air. Behind her the Bismarck stirred, her engines vibrating the ground beneath the watchers' feet. A deep rumble rolled across the harbour, steady and solemn. Men along the pier raised their hands in salute, eyes following the dark silhouette as it drifted into the mist. The harbour was filled with sound, yet silence hung heavier than the fog. Departure had begun, unseen but unstoppable. On the Bismarck's bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann stood beside Admiral Lutyens, both men silhouetted against the pale horizon. The glass windows rattled faintly with each pulse of the engines. "Signal the fleet," Lutyens said quietly, his tone calm, his expression unreadable. Lindemann nodded, giving the order with a single gesture. Flags rose swiftly up the signal mast, bright against the grey sky, flapping like the heartbeat of destiny. Around them, officers moved with the precision of ritual, every motion rehearsed, every command crisp. The ship's siren sounded once, long, low, and resonant. Its call rolled through the harbour like a farewell spoken in steel. Far below, sailors felt the vibration underfoot and exchanged silent glances. None spoke of fear, though every man carried it like breath. As the ship cleared the harbour, the icy Baltic wind cut across the deck, snapping the flags and stinging exposed skin. The Bismarck's bow cleaved the water cleanly, sending ripples outward like ripples through time. Seagulls followed in her wake, their cries faint and fleeting in the cold air. Smoke curled gently from her funnels, drifting low before dissolving into fog. Alongside her, Prinz Eugen kept perfect formation, two shapes moving in parallel through the mist. The destroyers Z-23, Z-24, and Hans Lodi escorted them briefly, their decks crowded with men giving final salutes. It was a moment of pride wrapped in foreboding. The sea smelled of metal and frost, its surface shifting with slow, deliberate swells. Each mile carried them further from safety, deeper into the unknown. The voyage had begun in silence, but would not remain so for long. Below decks, the ship was alive with motion, the thrum of turbines, the hiss of hydraulics, the rhythmic churn of propellers far beneath. In the mess hall, sailors finished their coffee in silence, eyes fixed on the trembling mugs before them. The air was thick with oil, salt, and anticipation. Somewhere down a narrow corridor, a radio played faintly, a waltz interrupted by static. In the engine rooms, men worked stripped to their undershirts despite the chill, sweat glistening on their forearms. The noise was relentless, deafening but familiar. It drowned out thought, and perhaps that was mercy. Messages from the bridge came through in clipped tones, translated into action without hesitation. In these lower decks, the war was mechanical, impersonal, steel obeying steel. Yet even here, among gears and fire, the air hummed with something larger than orders. It hummed with destiny. Up above, the officers kept watch over grey waves that blended seamlessly into the sky. The Baltic was calm, unnaturally so, as though the sea itself knew to stay quiet. Lutyens stood at the chart table, tracing his planned course west through the Kattegat and into the North Sea. His fingers hovered over potential threats: British reconnaissance planes, coastal radar, enemy submarines. The plan was built on precision, but beneath it lay uncertainty as vast as the ocean itself. "We are ghosts," he murmured, almost to himself, "and ghosts must not be seen." Lindemann heard but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The crew carried on their duties with practiced rhythm, the silence of discipline masking the tremor of fear. Outside, the ship's wake stretched long and white, a fleeting scar on an indifferent sea. As dusk approached, the fleet moved through the Skagerrak under a cloak of fog and radio silence. The destroyers veered off one by one, their final signals exchanged in flashes of coded light. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen pressed onward alone now, their engines echoing faintly in the mist. The sea darkened to lead, the horizon dissolving into shadow. Sailors stood on deck, Collars turned up, watching as the escorting ships vanished astern. It was a ritual separation, protection falling away, destiny closing in. One man crossed himself quietly. Another adjusted his collar as though to shake off unease. Above, the ship's searchlights were shuttered, leaving the decks dim and spectral. The warship moved unseen, her silhouette merging with cloud and night. Somewhere far ahead, the open Atlantic waited like a challenge. Inside the admiral's cabin, Lutyens and Lindemann reviewed the latest weather reports by lamplight. The air smelled faintly of ink and tobacco, and the steady ticking of a clock marked time in solemn cadence. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass, a whisper of what was to come. "The British will know soon enough," Lindemann said, breaking the silence. "Perhaps," Lutyens replied, eyes still fixed on the chart, "but by then we will already be gone." Between them lay the map of the North Sea, its blue expanse dotted with imagined dangers. The admiral's pencil circled a point far beyond Iceland, the Denmark Strait. "Our passage," he said simply. Lindemann nodded once, his jaw set. The moment was neither dramatic nor grand. It was quiet, inevitable, and deeply human. Night fell heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint glow of instruments and the phosphorescent foam trailing from the ship's sides. The sea grew rougher, waves slamming against the hull with a slow, measured rhythm. Above deck, the cold air bit into skin, sharp as glass. Watchmen squinted through binoculars, searching for movement that was not their own. The engines drummed a steady pulse beneath their feet, power contained, waiting to be unleashed. Somewhere in the dark, Prinz Eugen's silhouette flickered into view, a ghostly twin in motion. Between the two ships stretched only water and silence. In the radio room, operators sat poised over silent transmitters, forbidden to speak. The entire fleet seemed to move as one great shadow, invisible yet unstoppable. Each passing hour carried them closer to confrontation. By morning, the fog had thickened once more, swallowing horizon and sky alike. The Baltic faded behind them. The North Sea opened ahead, vast, grey and unknowable. The men on watch could see only a few hundred meters beyond the bow, the rest lost in shifting mist. Below decks, sleep came fitfully, haunted by the drone of engines and the thought of what awaited them. The officers stood in quiet conversation, voices low, aware of the weight of what had begun. For all their secrecy, fate had already seen them. The sea rolled endlessly, a mirror of steel reflecting their resolve. The voyage was underway, and there would be no turning back. In the grey light of May they vanished into mist, a silent beginning to a voyage history would never forget. The North Atlantic in May was a landscape of shifting grey, mist, ice and distance without mercy. Above it, RAF Coastal Command aircraft droned endlessly, their wings rimmed with frost and their engines growling against the cold. The men inside wore fur-lined jackets and oxygen masks crusted with ice, their breath clouding the small, fogged windows. Below them stretched an infinity of waves, indifferent and deceptive. Somewhere in that endless wilderness, the Bismarck was moving, silent and unseen. The pilot scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for shadows that did not belong. The ocean revealed nothing, only shifting patterns of light and cloud. Hours passed in monotony, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the hiss of static. Fatigue gnawed at their concentration, but the mission was relentless. The enemy was out there, and the Empire depended on finding him first. Inside the aircraft, the smell of fuel and damp wool filled the narrow fuselage. The floor vibrated beneath heavy boots, every tremor reminding the crew how thin the line between air and ocean truly was. The navigator traced their path on a map, speckled with pencil marks, his hands steady despite the cold. "Visibility 3 miles, the pilot muttered. eyes fixed on the horizon. Nothing yet. The clouds outside thickened, merging sea and sky into one vast, unbroken void. Far below, chunks of ice drifted aimlessly, colliding with dull, hollow sounds like distant drums. The men kept scanning, their eyes stinging from exhaustion. To find a single ship in the Atlantic was to find a needle in a living, moving world of grey. But the British could not afford failure. Not after the sinking of the Hood. Somewhere in that silence, vengeance searched for direction. At Bletchley Park, hundreds of miles from the icy sea, the battle was being fought in silence and code. In long wooden huts, lit by dim bulbs, rows of analysts hunched over papers filled with intercepted German signals. The room smelled of ink, tea, and sleepless nights. Machine cogs turned slowly inside the Enigma deciphering units, the rhythm steady and mechanical. Young women typed at furious speed, translating fragments of messages that hinted but never revealed. Operation Rheinübung, one message read, the word circled, underlined, whispered about. Admiral Tovey's fleet headquarters waited anxiously for any hint of direction. Somewhere between the dots and dashes, between cipher and chaos, a shape was emerging. A great ship, proud and wounded, was moving through the Atlantic fog. The analysts leaned closer to their machines, chasing a ghost through static. In this war, knowledge was as vital as gunfire. In the Admiralty War Room in London, maps of the North Atlantic covered the walls like an unfinished puzzle. Red pins marked convoys. Black lines traced suspected U-boat patrols. A single blue pin marked the Bismarck's last known position. Then nothing. Admirals and aides stood in tense clusters, their voices hushed but urgent. "She's out there somewhere," muttered one officer, tracing a hand along the map's edge, "and she's headed for our lifelines." Churchill had made his demand unmistakably clear: sink the Bismarck. The weight of that order filled the air like fog. Telegraphs chattered, dispatches flew, and destroyers were rerouted in desperate coordination. On the table, the vast Atlantic seemed to stare back, silent and defiant. The hunt had begun, but the prey was invisible. Far to the north, the heavy cruiser HMS Suffolk cut through the freezing seas of the Denmark Strait. Her hull shuddered against the icy swells, the deck slick with frost. Visibility was low, barely 2 miles, but the radar operators worked in silence, their screens glowing faintly in the darkness. Blips appeared and vanished, ghosts dancing on a green horizon of uncertainty. The men leaned closer, their breath fogging the glass. "Contact bearing 240 degrees, one whispered. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of machinery. The captain approached, eyes narrowing as he studied the display. "Hold course, confirm with Norfolk." Outside, snow began to fall, flakes melting instantly on the steel surface of the guns. The ocean seemed alive, hiding what it also betrayed. Somewhere beyond the fog, the hunters had finally caught a scent. Back in the radar room, the tension was electric, fragile, invisible, and absolute. The operator adjusted dials with gloved fingers, every flicker of the screen holding life or nothingness. The echo returned, faint but steady. "That's no iceberg," he said softly. On the bridge, the captain raised his binoculars, though sight was useless now. The sea was an opaque wall of grey and wind. Still he felt it, the presence of something immense beyond reach moving deliberately through the cold. He gave quiet orders. "Shadow her. Do not engage." Engines hummed lower, the ship settling into pursuit mode. The Suffolk became a phantom, slipping behind the fog. The hunted did not yet know it was being watched. Aboard the Bismarck, the weather had turned brutal. Sheets of icy rain lashed the decks, visibility near zero. The crew moved carefully, their gloved hands slick with salt water and sleet. Inside the bridge, Admiral Lutjens reviewed charts under red lamplight, his expression calm, his mind aware of unseen eyes. "The British are near," Lindemann said quietly. "Yes," Lutjens replied, "but the sea is still ours." He knew the danger, but he also knew the odds favored silence and speed. The Bismarck's engines roared beneath the storm, driving her westward toward the open Atlantic. Above, lightning flared briefly, illuminating the waves in spectral white. For a moment her silhouette appeared vast and invincible, and then it was gone again, swallowed by darkness. In the Suffolk's radio room, messages were whispered into static and inked into coded form. "Enemy sighted, shadowing at distance," the operator wrote. The paper trembled slightly as the ship pitched through the swells. The message raced through the ether to the Admiralty, to Tovey's command, to every vessel within range. Across the Atlantic, wireless stations crackled to life. Orders cascaded like falling dominoes: intercept, converge, destroy. In London, Churchill received the report in the small hours, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "Now," he said, exhaling smoke into the dim light, "the game is truly afoot." Outside, the city slept under blackout, unaware that its fate was being decided in freezing waters half a world away. The hunters had seen their prey, and the world would soon hold its breath. The next hours were a contest between sight and storm. The Bismarck's captain maneuvered to shake off her shadows, weaving through fog and squalls like a phantom. Each turn was a test of nerves, each wave a potential mask. The Suffolk and Norfolk struggled to maintain contact, their radar screens flickering with interference. Men watched the instruments with clenched jaws, knowing one slip could lose everything. Occasionally, gunfire was imagined in the distance, echoes perhaps, or tricks of wind. The tension grew unbearable, stretching thin as wire. In this battle, patience was as deadly as gunpowder. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to reveal its secret. The chase had become a duel of silence. By nightfall, the sea had frozen into stillness, fog, ice, and shadow merging into one. The British cruisers held their distance, trailing the German giants like ghosts through endless grey. The air was thick with suspense, heavy with inevitability. Every radar ping, every coded message was a heartbeat in a story that could end only in fire. At Bletchley Park, analysts leaned over new transmissions, their pens poised in trembling anticipation. Somewhere north of Iceland, two empires moved closer to collision. The ocean between them was no longer vast enough to hide fate. The hunt had begun in ice and silence, but it would end in thunder. Across the frozen sea, one question consumed them all. Where was the hunter now hiding? The Denmark Strait was a place of silence and violence, where the sea seemed older and colder than memory itself. Icebergs drifted like ghosts through the fog, their edges dissolving into the mist as though the ocean refused to reveal its secrets. Winds howled low and constant, a mournful sound that carried across the empty miles. Visibility fell to less than 2 miles, a grey wall of nothing, punctuated by the crash of waves against steel. Both sides moved blindly now, guided only by machines, instinct and faith. The Bismarck ploughed through the heavy seas, her bow cutting deep into the swell, water cascading over her decks like molten glass. On board, the air vibrated with restrained energy, the sense of being hunted and hunting at once. Far to the northwest, the British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk groped through the same fog, their radar screens flickering like candlelight in a storm. Men on both ships strained to see what the mist refused to show. The battle was already beginning, though no one had yet fired a shot. In Suffolk's radar room, the operators leaned close to the glowing green screen, their breath fogging in the cold air. Blips appeared, faint and uncertain, dancing at the edge of detection. "Contact, bearing 270, range 20 miles, one said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the hum of electronics. The officer beside him nodded, marking the position with a pencil that trembled slightly in his hand. Somewhere out there, beneath that shifting signal, was the most powerful warship in the world. The captain gave orders softly, his voice measured but tight. "Maintain shadowing distance. No lights, no transmissions." The ship creaked and rolled as waves slammed against her hull, every sound amplified in the tense quiet. Above, the bridge was lit in dim red, a world of shadows and whispers. Even the sea seemed to be listening. Aboard Bismarck, the fog was so thick that the crew could taste it, salt, oil, and cold in every breath. Lookouts squinted from their stations, eyes watering, their hands frozen to the rails. The horizon was gone, replaced by a void that moved and breathed with each gust of wind. Lindemann stood on the bridge beside Lutyens, his coat slick with mist, binoculars raised but useless. "Radar contact?" he asked. "Nothing confirmed," came the reply. The admiral said nothing, his gaze steady, his expression carved in composure. Inside, the ship groaned as waves struck her hull like the fists of an angry god. The Bismarck's crew moved in practiced rhythm, securing lines, checking ammunition, tightening bolts. Beneath their boots, the vibration of the engines was constant, a heartbeat in steel. Above it all hung a silence that felt heavier than sound. Back aboard Norfolk, the radar signal vanished, then reappeared, then vanished again. The operators adjusted dials, praying it was not simply the sea playing tricks on them. The captain's voice was low but sharp. "Confirm the contact. I want certainty before we act." Outside, sleet stung the deck, freezing instantly on the railings and turning every surface slick. The watch crew huddled in their greatcoats, peering into the fog for shapes that refused to form. When the radar pinged again, louder this time, a chill ran through the room. "She's there," whispered one of the young officers. Big as a mountain, the realization sank into every man aboard. The enemy was not just near, she was close enough to feel. The fog was no longer protection, it was confinement. Somewhere within it, death was moving unseen. At 19:22 hours, Suffolk's radar confirmed visual contact, a dark, towering mass emerging and fading at the edge of vision. The first clear sight of the Bismarck came not in daylight, but as a silhouette against the fog's faint glow. Men on deck froze, staring through binoculars at a shadow that seemed more myth than metal. "That's her," someone whispered. No order was needed, the words were enough. The cruisers turned sharply, maintaining distance, their engines rumbling low in the water. Searchlights remained off, guns trained into the void but silent. Messages were sent through coded light to Norfolk, short, urgent flashes in the darkness. "Enemy sighted. Engaging shadowing protocol." On board Bismarck, the lookouts reported the same, a faint glimmer astern, blinking like a heartbeat. The chase was no longer imagined, it had begun. In the British command network, news spread like electricity through wire. At Scapa Flow, Admiral Tovey read the message with a grim satisfaction. "We've found her," he said, voice low but steady. Around him, staff officers leaned over maps, plotting intercepts, calculating bearings, issuing orders that would set the entire home fleet in motion. "Send Hood and Prince of Wales north," he said. "She will not escape us." Far to the south, Churchill was informed, and for the first time in days allowed himself a smile. "Then may God be with our sailors," he murmured. Across the ocean, invisible lines of movement converged, from Iceland, from Newfoundland, from the British Isles. The fog that had concealed the hunter would soon conceal the hunted. The greatest pursuit of the war was tightening its noose. Aboard Bismarck, the tension deepened into something almost tangible. Orders were short, clipped, and quiet. Increase speed, course 270. Prepare for evasive action. The ship heaved and groaned as she turned into the waves, her massive hull cutting through walls of water. In the plotting room, officers marked potential enemy positions, their pencils leaving trails of uncertainty across the charts. "We are being shadowed," Lindemann said simply. Lutjens nodded. "Calm even now." "Then let them follow," he replied. "They will see what we are made of soon enough." Outside, the fog thickened, sealing them inside their own isolation. Somewhere beyond the grey curtain, eyes were watching, but the sea kept its silence. The hunter was being hunted, and neither side could yet see the other clearly. On Suffolk's bridge, the captain stood motionless, staring into the mist as though trying to read its secrets. His men whispered around him, voices low and tight. The radar blips pulsed steady now, one large, one smaller, the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen moving together like twin predators. "She's fast," the officer muttered. "Faster than we expected." The Suffolk's engines strained to keep pace, her hull creaking under pressure. The sea was a living thing, heaving, churning, testing the resolve of both hunter and hunted. Spray lashed against the bridge windows, streaking the glass with salt. The captain's fingers tightened around the railing, white against the black metal. He felt the weight of history pressing through the fog. Ahead, unseen but undeniable, destiny was gathering speed. As midnight neared, thunder rolled across the strait, not from the sky, but from distant guns firing blind into fog. The Bismarck tested her range, her main batteries rumbling like avalanches over water. The sound carried for miles, echoing through the mist, each detonation a pulse of fury. The British ships held their distance, unwilling to reveal their own position. Shells splashed harmlessly into the sea, plumes of white rising briefly before vanishing into grey. But the message was clear. The enemy was ready. Below decks, sailors braced themselves against the shockwave of distant fire, the sound crawling through the hull like thunder in a cave. It was not battle yet. It was warning. The sea between them trembled with anticipation, alive with waiting. The first real clash was coming. By morning, the fog had thickened into an ocean of cloud, swallowing ships, sound and sky alike. Both sides continued their slow, parallel dance, unseen yet aware, distant yet inseparable. The air was heavy, wet and tense with the charge of coming violence. On both bridges, officers stood in near silence, their thoughts drowned by the rhythm of the sea. Radar screens flickered, compasses trembled, engines groaned with restrained power. Somewhere ahead the grey veil hid destiny, one battle that would define the fate of two navies. The crews, exhausted but alert, waited for orders they knew would come with daylight. Even the gulls had vanished, unwilling to witness what was approaching. The wind whispered across the decks like a breath before a storm. Two forces, blind in fog yet drawn by fate, drifted toward collision. The dawn rose weak and colourless over the Denmark Strait, its light breaking through banks of grey fog that hung low upon a heaving sea. The cold air carried the faint scent of oil and smoke, the breath of two fleets converging on destiny. On the horizon, the outlines of Hood and Prince of Wales emerged through the haze, ghostly yet resolute, their decks alive with motion as men stood by their stations. Each sailor knew that within minutes, history would turn on the thunder of their guns. The water shimmered with cold fire, steel hulls cutting through the dim light like moving shadows. Far ahead, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen advanced in grim formation, their grey hulls almost indistinguishable from the sea they ruled. The wind whispered across the decks, carrying with it the low hum of turbines and the echo of orders shouted through brass tubes. There was no music here, only tension and breath, and the rhythmic pulse of engines beneath steel. On both sides, eyes strained toward the fog, each heartbeat a countdown to violence. The sun broke faintly through, a weak, indifferent witness to what was about to begin. The first shot came from Hood, her forward guns erupting with a sound that seemed to tear the horizon apart. Great plumes of smoke and flame leapt from her turrets, the shockwave racing down her decks as if the ship herself roared in defiance. Shells screamed across the water, the air splitting with a banshee cry that vanished into distance before erupting in colossal splashes near Bismarck's bow. The German crew moved with precision, each man trained to ritual, each motion a small act of control against the chaos they knew was coming. Lutyens gave no flourish, no cry of vengeance, only cold, clipped orders that summoned power from silence. The Bismarck answered, her 8 15-inch guns releasing thunder that rolled across the sea like the voice of an angry world. The entire ship recoiled, her hull trembling with a deep metallic groan that vibrated through every deck. Men covered their ears as dust and oil shook loose from the ceiling. In that instant, the grey morning turned white with smoke and flame. The battle had begun in earnest, and the strait itself seemed to convulse beneath the fury. On Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach stood gripping the bridge railing as shellfire screamed overhead, the sound a relentless tearing of sky and memory. His gunners worked feverishly to correct range, their hands black with cordite and sweat. Despite the biting cold, the ship shuddered violently as her forward turrets fired again, brass shells clattering across the deck, their heat still radiating through the steel. Range 17,000 yards. A voice shouted, the words barely audible over the din. Water erupted ahead, white towers crashing into the sea like the fists of some unseen god. Nearby, Hood's silhouette glowed briefly through the fog, the old battlecruiser holding her line, proud and unflinching despite her age. To the men who saw her she looked immortal, her wake slicing the sea in regal defiance. But even legends are made of steel, and steel can die. The air stank of burning oil and cordite, and the horizon itself seemed to shake with fury. Every man aboard knew that the next minute might belong to eternity. Aboard Bismarck, Lindemann stood silent, eyes fixed on the horizon where Hood loomed like a grey wall against the light. He gave the order to concentrate fire, his voice even, but his hand trembling just once before tightening on the map table. The gunners adjusted, the turrets swung, and another salvo roared from the decks in perfect unison. The noise was beyond sound, a pressure that rattled lungs and bones and faith. The shells crossed the sky in invisible arcs, cutting through fog and time alike. Below, in the ammunition rooms, crews fed shells into elevators, their muscles burning, their ears deafened by the rhythm of their own labor. One sailor muttered a prayer, half in faith, half in habit. Moments later, the lookouts shouted, "Hit!" Near the mainmast, the German crew exhaled as one, not in triumph but in grim confirmation. Across the sea, flames began to dance along Hood's deck, a flicker of orange that grew far too fast. The next moments unfolded with the slow cruelty of fate disguised as physics. A single shell, one among dozens, pierced Hood's thin deck armor, plunging deep into her aft magazine. For an instant there was only the crackle of fire, the faint rumble of internal detonation, and then light. A white-hot explosion ripped through the hull, splitting the ship open in a geyser of flame and steel that reached hundreds of feet into the air. Men were thrown like rag dolls, the decks tearing apart beneath their feet. The blast consumed everything: air, metal, humanity, until there was only a single towering column of smoke rising into the grey sky. On Prince of Wales, officers stared in disbelief as the pride of the Royal Navy simply vanished before their eyes. "She's gone," one whispered, voice cracking under the weight of the words. The radio fell silent. There was nothing left to report. In 8 minutes, one of the greatest warships ever built was reduced to ash and memory. The sea where Hood had sailed was now a graveyard. Twisted wreckage floating in oil, lifeboats overturned, the cries of survivors already fading into the cold wind. Prince of Wales turned hard to port, her guns still firing defiantly as she withdrew under orders. The decks were slick with spray and grief, the air thick with disbelief. In the radar rooms, men stared blankly at their screens, the green pulses meaningless now. "Keep firing," Captain Leach said quietly, though he knew their shells would not change what had happened. On Bismarck, the German sailors watched the wreck vanish into the fog, the cheers that might have risen dying instead in the throats of men who had seen too much too soon. Even victory in that moment felt hollow, a triumph that carried the stench of finality. Lucian said nothing, only adjusted his gloves and turned to his officers. "Maintain course," he ordered softly. The engines growled in response, and the sea swallowed another secret. Far above the strait, the smoke spread into thin layers that darkened the morning sky, its scent of oil drifting for miles across the cold Atlantic wind. On nearby ships, sailors stared at the black column and knew instinctively that something vast had died. Word travelled faster than radio, carried in the faces of men who returned from the bridge with eyes wide and hollow. The British fleet's pride had been struck from existence, and in its place rose something colder, harder, more determined. Messages flashed across the Atlantic, coded in urgency and grief. "Sink the Bismarck." In London, Churchill was told within the hour, his reply simple and grim: "Then we must finish the job." In Berlin, the announcement came with restrained celebration, though even there, officers spoke in low voices, aware of what had been unleashed. The sea once again had chosen no side. It had only claimed its price. Within Bismarck's hull, the damage from the British return fire was assessed in tight clinical language. One fuel tank ruptured, the forward radar damaged, a wound small but prophetic. Engineers worked by dim red light, the smell of diesel thick in the air. Sparks flew as torches cut into twisted panels, water sloshing at their boots. The ship still moved like a living thing, powerful and wounded, her engines labouring under strain. Above them, Lutyens reviewed reports with the precision of a man who understood that victory and doom were often written in the same ink. "Continue west," he said, his tone a whisper against the storm. On deck, sailors stared back at the grey horizon where Hood had burned and vanished. The silence that followed the battle was worse than the noise, a vacuum that no word could fill. The war had many victories yet to come, but none would ever again feel pure. Back on Prince of Wales, smoke hung low around the ship, her decks scarred and her crew shaken. The survivors from Hood, barely 3 in number, were pulled aboard, their faces pale and their bodies trembling from cold and disbelief. One whispered that he had seen the ship's decks rise beneath his feet before the world became fire. His words were recorded, though none who heard them would ever forget. The crew tended to the wounded in silence, bandages soaked in salt and oil. Above them the gulls had vanished, the sky left empty, except for drifting ash. Captain Leach stared at the horizon, jaw tight, knowing that retreat was survival, but that honour demanded more. The radio crackled with orders from Admiralty: regroup, avenge, pursue. Even through exhaustion, the message rang clear. The chase was far from over. When the smoke cleared and the sea began to settle, it was as though the world had paused in reverence and dread. The wreckage of Hood drifted on the tide, small pieces of something once immense, while Bismarck vanished into the west, her wake stretching like a scar across the water. News travelled faster than the waves, reaching ports, pubs and palaces alike. Across Britain, the name Hood became both lament and rallying cry, the embodiment of loss and the spark of vengeance. Churchill ordered every ship available to hunt down the German battleship that had dared to destroy a legend. Men who had never seen the sea swore that justice would follow her wake. But the ocean is no courtroom, and the coming days would prove that even justice must fight through storm and steel. In 8 minutes Britain's pride was gone, and with it the illusion of invincibility. The sea lay heavy and metallic beneath a bruised sky, the waves slick with oil and the smell of iron thick in the air. Bismarck cut through the cold Atlantic swell, her hull trembling faintly with each rotation of the great propellers. But below the proud rhythm of her engines she was bleeding, slowly, invisibly, lethally. A shell from Prince of Wales had pierced her hull near the waterline, rupturing a fuel tank deep inside the forward compartments. The engineers had found it within hours, a hiss of leaking oil and the thin, rhythmic gurgle of seawater finding its way in. Men waded through ankle-deep flooding, flashlights flickering off rivets slick with diesel. The air down there was thick, almost solid, with heat, fumes, and the reek of smoke that never fully cleared. Pumps groaned under strain as the crew tried to stem the slow drowning from within. Every clang of a hammer was a reminder. Victory had come at a cost not yet paid in full. The ship lived, but she was wounded. In the lower compartments, the sound was constant, metallic, alive, a heartbeat of steel and strain. Damage control teams worked in near darkness, their faces lit only by the orange glow of portable lamps swaying with the roll of the ship. They crawled along pipes and bulkheads slick with seawater, their boots slipping in the mixture of oil and brine that pooled at their feet. Every few minutes a shout echoed through the corridors. Pressure rising, or pump failing. Words that carried more fear than the shells of battle. Condensation dripped from the ceilings in slow, heavy droplets, falling onto the backs of men bent in effort. Their uniforms were soaked, their hands blistered, their eyes red from smoke that clung to every breath. The constant vibration of the engines became both comfort and curse, proof of life, yet a reminder that motion itself could spread the damage. In that twilight world of metal and water, time dissolved into repetition. Each task completed seemed only to buy another hour of survival. Above them, the sea pressed its weight against the hull like a living enemy, patient and unyielding. In the medical bay, the wounded were laid out on stretchers along the corridor walls, the air smelling of disinfectant, salt and blood. Doctors worked with quiet urgency, their hands steady even as the ship rolled beneath them. One sailor moaned softly, his face ghost-pale under the harsh lamp as a surgeon stitched a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Another gripped a small crucifix between trembling fingers, whispering a prayer that mingled with the hum of generators. The floor was sticky with antiseptic and seawater, a blend that spoke of both survival and decay. Nurses, young and silent, passed bandages from table to table, their faces streaked with exhaustion. Somewhere down the corridor, an engine thumped irregularly, the sound filtering through like a failing heartbeat. Above the noise, the intercom crackled with calm, disciplined reports, damage percentages, pump rates, fuel estimates. The voices were detached, measured, professional, but between them hung something heavier, the unspoken truth that the great ship was no longer whole. On the bridge, Lindemann stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where a dark slick spread far behind the ship. The oil trail stretched for miles, visible even in the dim light, a black ribbon that betrayed her position to every enemy within the Atlantic. "We cannot hide this," he said quietly to Lieutenant, who stood motionless beside him. The admiral's expression remained composed, though the weight of his silence carried more than any order. The North Atlantic was vast, but the enemy's eyes were many, and Bismarck was now leaving a signature across its face. "We continue west," Lieutenant finally said. "Speed must hold." His tone was one of discipline, not defiance, though both men knew what it meant. Every mile gained would be another chance for the hunters to close in. A lookout crossed the deck, saluting stiffly, his boots splashing through puddles of rain and spray. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, yet the smell of burning fuel still clung to every breath. The sea, indifferent as ever, swallowed her trail and carried it onward. Inside the forward engine room, the engineers fought a battle no less desperate than the one fought above the waves. They worked by touch and sound, their ears tuned to every vibration, every unnatural tone that hinted at failure. Pipes rattled, valves hissed, and the floor quivered as the ship adjusted course through heavy seas. Men shouted over the mechanical thunder, their words drowned by the roar of turbines that refused to sleep. One chief engineer, his face blackened with soot, traced a gloved hand along a seam in the bulkhead where warm water trickled like blood from a wound. He called for sealing compound, for clamps, for anything that could hold the sea back. Sparks showered from a welder's torch, reflecting in the puddles like fleeting stars in a world of iron. The air was so hot it felt solid, each breath heavy enough to burn. Somewhere deep in the ship, a pump failed with a hollow metallic cough. "Get it running," someone barked, though exhaustion had long stolen strength from their voices. The men worked because there was nothing else to do. The ocean waited for those who stopped. On deck, the contrast was striking. Clean air, open space, and the deceptive calm of wind over steel. The sea had settled slightly, its surface dark and glassy, reflecting the thin clouds drifting low overhead. Sailors moved along the railings with caution, scraping away congealed oil that had splattered upward from the leaking tanks. Every movement left a smear on their gloves, a reminder that the ship itself was bleeding into the ocean it sought to command. The gulls that followed at a distance now circled lower, attracted by debris and the strange iridescent sheen left in her wake. Far astern, the wake stretched like a confession, too long to deny, too dark to ignore. Below, they knew the leak still spread, finding its way into compartments not yet flooded. The air smelled faintly of diesel and salt, the scent of life and loss intertwined. A petty officer paused by the main turret and looked down at the slick glistening behind them. "We'll pay for that," he said quietly. No one disagreed. That night, the crew ate in silence. The mess hall, usually filled with laughter and talk, had become a chamber of quiet chewing and faraway stares. The clatter of tin plates and the low hum of ventilation filled the space with a false normalcy that fooled no one. Conversation was unnecessary. The faces said enough. The cook served thin stew, the smell of onions and diesel mixing in the humid air. A young sailor stared at his spoon until the light shimmered in the metal like firelight, and he thought of home. Across from him, a petty officer lifted a mug of coffee and drank it cold, his eyes fixed on the deck as if listening for something beneath the noise. Somewhere above them, footsteps echoed in slow rhythm along the passageway. The vibration of the engines pulsed through the floor like a second heartbeat. No one mentioned Hood, but the silence itself became a kind of mourning, and in that silence they understood that victory had already changed its shape. At midnight, Lindemann met with his senior officers in the plotting room, the red lamps casting long shadows over maps of the North Atlantic. Fuel loss estimated at 2,000 tons, reported the chief engineer. Leak, not fully contained, range severely reduced. The numbers fell like weights upon the table. each one a small inevitable surrender. The admiral listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "We must reach Saint-Nazaire," he said at last. The plan was spoken plainly, but its risk was enormous. To cross the North Atlantic while hunted, crippled and bleeding. A young officer asked if they might turn north instead, toward Norway. Lindemann shook his head gently. "No, the sea decides now." The chart lights flickered briefly, and for a moment every man in that room looked older than his years. The admiral reached for his pen and drew a single line across the map, a path through danger, perhaps through legend. The ink bled faintly on the page, spreading like oil on water. By dawn the damaged crews were still at work, their bodies swaying with the motion of the ship as she fought her way through rougher seas. The wind had turned, blowing cold and sharp from the north, carrying with it the distant promise of pursuit. Down below, pumps whined steadily, pushing back against the sea's slow, inevitable invasion. The oil slick widened behind them, dark and gleaming under the morning light. "It looks like smoke upon the water," one sailor murmured, watching from the railing. "A trail for angels to follow." Another laughed bitterly, but no one corrected him. In the engine room, the chief finally allowed his men to rest in shifts, their faces streaked with grime and salt. The Bismarck's heartbeat continued, strong, steady, but wounded. The great ship pressed on toward the open ocean, her destiny written in the foam behind her. Above the endless grey expanse, the gulls still followed, circling in the distance like memories that refused to fade. The sea rolled gently now, almost kindly, though beneath it lay the quiet certainty of pursuit. In the radio room an operator listened to the static between transmissions, convinced he could hear something. A whisper of Morse, perhaps, or just the sea speaking in its eternal voice. The admiral watched the horizon, his gloved hand resting lightly on the railing. Around him, the crew worked without complaint, each man carrying the invisible weight of what had been gained and what had been lost. The deck shone wet and dark under the pale light, and every step echoed faintly in the open air. From a distance the Bismarck still looked invincible, a fortress of steel moving through the waves with unbroken pride. But below the surface her blood ran freely, unseen but unstoppable. The hunter had drawn blood, but it was her own that now poured into the sea. The message from the Admiralty arrived before dawn, its words clipped and electric, pulsing through the cables that linked every ship and station across the North Atlantic. Sink the Bismarck. It was not an order, it was an obsession wrapped in steel and signal, and it spread through the Royal Navy like a fever. In London, Churchill demanded hourly reports, his voice cutting through war rooms already humming with exhaustion. "No respite," he said quietly, the smoke from his cigar curling above the map of the Atlantic. No excuses. On the operations tables, lines of coloured thread stretched across the ocean, each one marking the course of ships converging on a single moving point. Carriers from the south, cruisers from the north, destroyers sweeping like wolves across the convoy routes. The sea was no longer vast. It was a chessboard soaked in salt and waiting. Even the sky seemed to lean forward, heavy with the scent of rain and fuel as the hunt began. Somewhere out there, the most powerful ship in the world fled west, wounded but not yet caught. The carrier Victorious turned into the wind, her flight deck slick with spray, as deck crews wrestled torpedoes into place. The air was cold enough to bite through gloves, and the roar of the engines drowned every thought that wasn't survival. Pilots strapped into their Swordfish biplanes, the smell of oil and leather thick around them. They were relics of an earlier age, slow, fabric-winged, fragile against the might of a battleship. But in war, desperation can make even relics lethal. One by one, the aircraft lifted from the deck, their engines whining into the Atlantic dusk. Below, sailors watched in silence, hats pulled low against the wind as the planes vanished into the fog. "God help them," someone whispered, though no one replied. Hours later, through rain and cloud, they found her, a shape of shadow and flame upon the grey horizon. Flares burst in the dark, tracers dancing in the air like sparks from the forge of history. When the planes returned, one was missing, but the hunt had found its scent. Far below the clouds, Bismarck pushed through the swells like a wounded animal that refused to stop running. The sea was harsh, the wind unrelenting, and yet her engines still carried her forward through walls of green and grey water. Salt stung every open wound in her hull, and the oil trail spread wider behind her, an unintentional beacon to the world. Inside, men worked in near silence, their faces pale under red lights, their movements mechanical from lack of sleep. The ship's radio operators listened to the crackle of static, knowing that every transmission could reveal their position. "Maintain silence," came Lutyens' order, repeated again and again, and yet, across the void, their enemies were listening too. The faint signals of machinery, the rhythm of turbines, the heartbeat of a ship, too proud to die quietly. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, had become smaller with every passing hour. Each wave seemed to whisper the same question: how long can you run? In the Admiralty's war room, the walls glowed with the dim light of map lamps, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the rustle of paper. Officers leaned over the charts like gamblers, their eyes bloodshot from nights without rest. Small model ships were moved by trembling fingers, repositioned according to decoded signals and intercepted bearings. "She's turning south," one analyst said. "No," another countered, tracing a line with the tip of his pencil. "She's heading for France." The voices overlapped, low but urgent, and the sound of the typewriters filled every pause. In the corner, Churchill watched in silence, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. He knew the truth that none of them dared to say aloud. If Bismarck reached the Luftwaffe's range in France, she would live to kill again. Every hour mattered, every ship mattered, and somewhere beyond those walls, 1,000 men were already chasing her through storm and exhaustion. The destroyers moved like phantoms, skimming the surface of a sea that wanted to swallow them whole. The nights were black and freezing, the decks coated with ice, and the men on watch could feel the Atlantic wind cutting through their coats like knives. They slept in brief, shivering intervals, their bodies bruised from the constant sway of the ship. Below decks, engines screamed in protest, their vibrations turning the floor into a trembling drum. "We're burning fuel faster than we can refuel," one officer warned, but the captain only nodded. The chase would not stop. At dawn, the destroyers met their tankers in heavy seas, a dangerous ballet of hoses and steel as waves crashed between them. The smell of diesel hung thick in the air, mingling with salt and fear. Men clung to rails slick with frost, their hands numb, their hearts steady. The refueling line snapped once, lashing across the deck like a whip. No one looked up. They knew the cost of stopping. Above the clouds, Catalina patrol planes scoured the ocean in widening circles, their crews staring down through waves of mist that blurred sky and sea into one endless grey. The men inside were ghosts of themselves, unshaven, sleepless, their hands trembling on the binoculars. The engines droned like distant thunder, monotonous yet comforting. The navigator's chart was littered with penciled coordinates, an evolving portrait of obsession. They searched for a shape, a shadow, a reflection that might mean everything. At 10:30 a.m., one pilot spotted it, a faint dark wake cutting across the white caps far below. "Contact," he shouted, his voice cracking through the radio. The words raced across the Atlantic faster than any torpedo. The chase was no longer blind. The coordinates spread like wildfire through the fleet, every ship turning, converging, accelerating toward destiny. The sky had spoken, and the hunt tightened its grip. On Bismarck's bridge, the news came from silence. Radio intercepts, bearings changing. The pattern of pursuit closing in. Lucian stared at the map, one gloved finger tracing the distance to France, less than 500 miles, but each one now filled with danger. "We will make it," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed no certainty. Lindemann nodded, unwilling to contradict him in front of the crew. Outside, the sea raged, waves bursting over the bow and flooding the forecastle. In icy torrents, men lashed themselves to the guns to avoid being thrown overboard, their faces raw from wind and salt. The air smelled of cold iron and oil, the scent of defiance made tangible. No signals, Lucian's reminded, though deep within the ship, a single transmission escaped, a brief, broken message to Berlin, one that told the world Bismarck was damaged but fighting on. It would prove to be her final confession. Night fell with a violence of its own. Rain, lightning, and the roar of waves pounding against hulls that had forgotten stillness. In the dark, the British destroyers fanned out in formation, their radar beams sweeping across the endless black. Contact lost, came one report, then another, and still they pressed on. The sea was alive with confusion, filled with phantom echoes and imagined shadows. One destroyer launched flares, pale ghosts that drifted down through the rain, illuminating nothing but water. The men cursed softly, their words carried away by the wind. Below decks, they drank cold tea and stared at maps that offered no mercy. "She's out there," a young sailor whispered. "She's got to be." Somewhere beyond the storm, the Bismarck still moved, slower now, bleeding fuel, but still free. For the hunters, exhaustion was nothing compared to the terror of losing the scent. The ocean gave nothing willingly. By the third day, the chase had become a contest of endurance between man and nature. The Atlantic battered every ship, soaking decks and freezing flesh, but the pursuit never wavered. Sailors marked time not by clocks but by shifts, meals, and brief snatches of dreamless sleep. The radio rooms buzzed constantly, their operators translating fragments of static into meaning. Admirals barked orders through the hiss of interference, their voices hoarse but unwavering. On King George V, Tovey leaned over his plotting table, the lamps casting hard shadows over his weathered face. "She's running out of time," he said. Outside, the waves shattered against the bow like artillery fire. The fleet pressed on, each ship now an extension of will rather than fuel. Somewhere ahead, the horizon remained blank, but the men could feel her presence like a heartbeat in the dark. Dawn broke again, bleak and metallic. Over a sea that had forgotten peace, the sun rose through mist that shimmered like cold glass. And in that strange stillness, the radio crackled to life with a single breathless message: "Enemy in sight." The words carried across the fleet like a spark through dry tinder. Crews rushed to stations, engines roared to full power, and binoculars filled with the faint, unmistakable outline of Bismarck on the horizon. The hunt that had consumed the Atlantic for 4 endless days had finally found its prey. On the bridges of the pursuing ships, men felt the strange duality of relief and dread, for finding her meant ending her, and that ending would be terrible. Churchill received the report with a nod, the ghost of a smile beneath the fatigue. The order was simple now: engage at dawn. The sea, which had held them all in suspense, was suddenly alive again. For 4 days and nights the Atlantic held its breath, and both hunter and hunted prayed for sight. The North Atlantic raged like a living thing, waves rearing and collapsing in endless grey mountains beneath a sky bruised by rain and thunder. Wind tore across the sea with a howl that seemed almost human, bending the spray into sheets that blinded the lookouts and stung their eyes raw. Bismarck struggled forward through the chaos, her great hull rising and falling with a rhythm that defied both nature and exhaustion. Water crashed across her decks in torrents, smashing against her guns and washing through every open seam. Men lashed themselves to the railings as the storm swallowed the horizon whole. Inside, the lights flickered as generators fought to keep the power steady, the air thick with the smell of salt fuel and the faint tang of ozone. Below decks, the wounded groaned as each roll of the ship turned pain into motion. The hull creaked like an old cathedral groaning under its own weight, and through it all the engines kept beating, steady, determined, defiant. She would not stop. The storm became both ally and enemy, a cloak and a curse. To the British it was a wall of blindness that scattered radar returns and twisted bearings beyond sense. To the Germans it was a sanctuary bought in lightning and fear. Bismarck used the tempest as cover, turning southward in a desperate bid to outrun her hunters. The crew worked by instinct and calculation, adjusting course through bursts of static and broken compass readings. "The sea is with us," one officer muttered, though no one could hear him over the gale. Above, the deck pitched violently, and water slammed against the bridge windows with such force it rattled the steel frames. The ship's bow vanished into troughs so deep they felt like the edge of the world. Every few minutes the helmsman wiped salt from his eyes and corrected course by feel alone. For hours at a time they vanished into the storm, unseen, unheard, untouchable. But storms do not last forever, and neither did hope. In the radio room, silence became more dangerous than sound. The operators worked in darkness, lit only by the dim glow of instruments that flickered like fireflies. Their headphones hissed with static, a relentless whisper of distance and interference. Occasionally, a broken message broke through, fragments of Morse code, a partial bearing, a voice half lost in noise. Enemy aircraft reported, position uncertain, repeat, uncertain. The words came in and out like echoes across an ocean of static. One young radioman leaned back, his eyes hollow with fatigue, his fingers trembling over the key. He had not slept in 30 hours, nor spoken above a whisper in half as long. A cup of cold coffee floated lazily on the desk as the ship pitched beneath him. "We are ghosts," he murmured to no one. And in that storm he was right. For the Atlantic, for a moment, forgot that Bismarck still lived. Far to the east, aboard HMS Royal, the British air crews readied their Swordfish biplanes in the hangars, their engines coughing to life amid the roar of wind. The flight deck tilted beneath them as the carrier rolled, and men shouted orders that vanished into the rain. Mechanics tightened bolts and wiped moisture from instruments, working with the urgency of men who knew the line between courage and futility. The pilots stood beside their machines, drenched in oil and seawater, goggles streaked with mist. "We'll find her," one said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The biplanes, relics of an earlier war, seemed laughably small against the power of the storm. Yet they were the Royal Navy's last thread of hope, wings of canvas and courage sent to fight a ship of steel. Above them, lightning tore the clouds open, flooding the deck in brief, colourless light. Somewhere beyond that storm lay their quarry, a ghost wrapped in thunder. The order came at last: prepare to launch. On Bismarck's bridge, visibility was less than a mile, a white void filled with rain and motion. Lindemann stood beside the chart table, his coat soaked through, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "Hold course 210, he ordered. "Keep the bow into the waves." The helmsman obeyed, muscles straining against the wheel as the ship groaned through each rise and fall. Every window on the bridge was streaked with water, and outside the world was reduced to grey movement and wind. The storm muffled all other sound, and even the engines seemed distant as if submerged. Men spoke in gestures, their mouths moving against the roar, their words swallowed whole. Yet there was a strange comfort in the violence, the knowledge that no radar, no patrol, no watchful eye could find them here. "Let the storm hide us," Lindemann said softly, for now it did. In the galley, sailors huddled over cold tins of food, their spoons rattling as the deck lurched beneath them. The air smelled of diesel and wet clothes, a mixture that clung to every breath. Conversation was scarce, just the scrape of metal and the creak of shifting bulkheads. A man laughed once, short and sharp, when a cup slid across the table and shattered against the wall. "At least it's not a shell," someone muttered, and the brief humour faded into silence. Above them, the ship's guns moaned with the pressure of the wind, the barrels weeping condensation that looked like tears. One sailor closed his eyes and imagined the quiet of the Baltic, the calm water that had once carried the Bismarck from her birthplace into glory. He remembered the cheers, the music, the promise of invincibility. Now that same sea seemed endless and cruel. It was no longer water, it was judgment. The Swordfish took to the air like ghosts, their engines sputtering against the gale. The waves rose so high that the aircraft nearly touched the water with each descent, wings trembling under the strain. Spray drenched the pilots, freezing against their goggles, turning the horizon into a wall of silver and white. They flew in formation as best they could, guided only by compass and hope. The clouds closed around them, thick as smoke, erasing sky and direction alike. Visibility 0, one pilot reported, his voice shaking over the radio. "We'll keep looking." Lightning flashed again, revealing the wild dance of waves beneath them. A vast, restless grave waiting for ships and men alike. The search continued hour after hour, circling, crossing, doubling back through the same patch of storm-tossed ocean. But there was nothing. The ocean had swallowed its secret whole, and in that void the Bismarck slipped farther south. Inside the German ship, the crew worked through exhaustion, driven by duty rather than faith. Pumps still rattled, fuel still leaked, but the ship refused surrender. In the engine rooms, men took shifts, standing ankle-deep in water, checking gauges that trembled with every impact of the waves. The air was hot, thick, alive with vibration, the smell of burned oil and sweat mixing into something metallic and permanent. Above, the storm drummed against the hull like distant artillery. A petty officer knelt to tighten a valve, his fingers numb, his face grey from fatigue. "Will they find us?" someone asked. "Not yet," he said, tightening one last bolt. There was no triumph in his voice, only resolve. In that moment, every man aboard became part of the machine, weary, defiant, unbroken. The next morning, the storm began to break. The rain softened into mist, and the wind fell to a restless whisper that rolled across the waves like smoke. The sky above them cleared just enough to show light, pale, fractured, uncertain. Bismarck emerged from the clouds like a relic, her paint streaked, her decks glistening, her once proud flag tattered and soaked. The sea around her was quiet now, but the silence felt heavier than the thunder it replaced. Men climbed to the upper decks, blinking against the returning daylight, their faces drawn and hollow. They had escaped the storm, but not the war. Lindemann stepped outside, his boots splashing through puddles, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, he knew, the British were waiting. Somewhere they were listening. And still he gave the only order that made sense: full speed ahead. The ocean lay vast and merciless before them, a theatre of pursuit where visibility no longer mattered. Only time, The Bismarck ploughed onward through the swells, her engines steady, her wake long and black. Behind her stretched the trail of oil, still leaking, still betraying her with every mile. The crew returned to stations, to duty, to silence. Above them, gulls appeared again, circling the ship as if drawn by the gravity of fate. The radio remained quiet, but the storm's memory lingered in every creak and echo of the hull. Somewhere to the north, the British regrouped, recalculating their approach, waiting for a gap in the clouds to reveal their prey once more. But for now the Atlantic was hers again, for a moment fragile and fleeting. Even wounded, the giant pressed on, alone, silent, and still unwilling to die. The storm had passed, leaving the Atlantic restless and grey beneath a ceiling of low clouds that smelled of rain and oil. On the deck of HMS Royal, the sea hissed against the hull as mechanics swarmed around the biplanes that would soon change history. The Swordfish sat lined in rows, their canvas wings trembling in the wind, their wooden frames slick with salt. They looked fragile, relics of another era, absurd against the scale of the hunt. Yet beneath their patched skins hung torpedoes of cold steel and purpose. The pilots, faces chapped and pale, leaned over their instruments in silence as engines coughed to life. Oil smoke curled through the air, mixing with the scent of damp rope and aviation fuel. Officers shouted orders through cupped hands, voices vanishing into the roar of propellers. Above the chaos, the carrier pitched with each swell, its deck a moving target for takeoff. In that narrow window between storm and nightfall, they prepared to strike a legend. As the deck crews waved their final signals, the first Swordfish lurched forward into the gale, its wheels bouncing against wet steel before vanishing into open air. The biplane dipped low, barely clearing the waves before finding fragile lift amid the spray. One after another, they followed, a procession of fabric wings and roaring engines rising from a ship that seemed impossibly small in the Atlantic's vastness. Rain stung their faces, freezing against goggles, turning every breath into a cloud. The wind tore through the wires between their wings, making the aircraft hum with a trembling, eerie song. Each pilot knew how absurd the mission sounded. Ancient biplanes against the most powerful battleship afloat. But the sea had never cared for fairness. They flew low and steady, trusting the compass more than sight as clouds closed around them. Beneath the storm's grey belly they began to fan out like ghosts, and ahead of them waited the Bismarck, hidden in the fading light. Inside the cockpits, the air was alive with vibration and cold. Gauges rattled, needles shivering with the effort of keeping balance between gravity and lift. The pilots wore heavy gloves, but still their fingers went numb against the control sticks. Their scarves flapped violently in the open wind, threads unraveling as they pressed closer toward destiny. Over the radio came fragments of communication, clipped, distorted, half lost in static. Maintain heading, hold low. Visual contact expected soon. Beneath them, the waves rolled like dark muscle, the foam white and violent under the setting sun. The torpedoes hung steady under each wing, heavy and obedient to purpose. "God help us," muttered Lieutenant Esmond, one of the flight leaders, his voice trembling with both fear and focus. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Bismarck waited like a shadow made real. The biplanes pressed on, their engines echoing across the water like the heartbeat of a smaller, braver age. On board Bismarck, the lookouts were the first to see them, specks on the horizon that should not have been possible. "Flugzeuge, steuerbord!" The cry went out, carried through the corridors like the beginning of a storm. Klaxons wailed. Anti-aircraft crews ran to their guns, their boots slamming against the steel deck slick with rain. Within seconds the ship came alive. Hatches slammed, guns elevated, and the once still giant roared to life with purpose renewed. The smell of cordite filled the air before the first shot was even fired. Ammunition elevators clanked as shells fed upward, loaders shouting numbers over the engine's deep growl. Ready to fire, someone screamed, his words drowned by the eruption of flak. The sky above Bismarck turned black with smoke and orange with flame, the clouds shredded by hundreds of shells. For a moment, the battleship seemed to stand unassailable again, a fortress of thunder in the storm. But even fortresses have blind spots, and fate often flies slow. The Swordfish came in low, skimming the waves so closely that seawater streaked their undercarriages. Machine gun fire tore through the air, the tracers slicing ribbons of orange through the grey. The pilots could feel the heat of near misses, the wind buffeting their fragile frames as explosions burst around them. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and burning oil, the chemical perfume of death at close range. Flak shells detonated in the clouds above, showering fragments into the sea. "Steady!" shouted Ismonde, his voice steady, even as his aircraft rocked violently in the turbulence. The horizon flashed with muzzle fire from Bismarck's guns, each blast a thunderclap that rattled the ribs of the planes. The torpedo aimer leaned forward, squinting through mist, his gloved hand hovering over the release. The sea ahead was alive with fury and light, and through it all the Swordfish pressed on, unbroken by fear or logic. One plane was hit directly, a burst of shrapnel tearing through its wing, the fabric ripping open like paper under a knife. Flames burst from the engine, the roar turning into a scream as the aircraft tilted sharply toward the water. "He's gone," someone whispered through the radio. Though there was no time to mourn, the rest flew through the smoke, closer now, close enough to see the great black hull rise and fall through the spray. It looked impossible, a mountain of iron moving with the precision of thought. The pilots could see men running along its deck, flashes of gunfire, and the whirl of tracers spinning toward them. "Release torpedo," came the command. One after another, the aircraft dropped their payloads, the torpedoes falling with elegant precision before striking the waves and running straight and true. They left long, silver wakes in the dark water, racing toward the giant that filled the horizon. The battle's balance had shifted to the sea itself. On the Bismarck, alarms screamed as the torpedoes closed in. "Hard to port," Lindemann shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines and the shriek of incoming water. The ship heaved violently, her bow carving into the waves, throwing spray high into the air. The first torpedo struck amidships, sending a shudder through the hull that rattled light fixtures and buckled bulkheads. Men were thrown from their feet, tools clattering across the decks. The second exploded near the starboard side, flooding compartments that were already weakened by damage from earlier days. Water burst through cracks like breath from a wounded lung. And then came the third, low, precise, merciless, striking near the stern. The explosion was sharp, not massive, but it carried a resonance that rippled through every deck. On the bridge, Lindemann gripped the railing as the vibration ran beneath his boots. Something vital had broken. In the steering compartment, the lights went out. Smoke filled the air as the men inside coughed and stumbled through darkness, their ears ringing from the impact. The rudder control levers had jammed, bent by the blast that had warped the steel around them. "Steering's gone," someone shouted, their voice thick with panic. Water poured in through shattered seams, the floor rising with each breath of the sea. Men waded through waist-deep water, trying to reach manual controls, but the machinery was twisted beyond repair. The smell of oil was overwhelming, the heat suffocating. Above them, the ship began to list slightly to port. The engines continued to roar, but the wheel no longer answered. On the bridge, an officer reported the damage in a voice that sounded almost numb. "Rudder jammed 30 degrees to port. steering lost. The words hung in the air like a verdict. The Bismarck could still move, but she could no longer turn. As the Swordfish circled away, the pilots watched their work from afar, their aircraft buffeted by wind and smoke. The Bismarck was still afloat, still firing, still defiant, but her movements were wrong, slow, uneven, wounded. "We got her," one pilot murmured, his voice barely audible through the static. The sky behind them glowed faintly with fire as the last traces of gunfire died into distance. They turned north, battered and low on fuel, their fragile biplanes vanishing once more into the mist. On board the carrier, crews waited for their return with a silence that bordered on reverence. One by one, the aircraft limped home, wings riddled with holes, engines sputtering with exhaustion. The pilots climbed out covered in salt, oil and disbelief. Against all reason, against every expectation, they had struck the unstrikable, and somewhere beyond the horizon history had shifted course. Night fell slowly over the Atlantic, the wind calming into uneasy whispers that rippled across the waves. The Bismarck continued southward, her engines steady but her fate sealed. Inside, men worked to free the jammed rudder, sparks flying from torches that fought against twisted steel. But the damage was too deep, the wound too final. The ship still moved forward, but now she turned endlessly in slow, helpless arcs. The realization spread through the crew like a chill. The chase had reversed. The hunter was now the hunted. Above, the stars returned, cold and brilliant, reflecting off the oil-streaked surface of the sea. In the distance, the faint hum of British engines began to grow once more. The world's greatest warship had been crippled, not by strength, but by fragility, by wooden wings and the courage of men who refused to yield. From wooden wings and fabric canvas came the blow that would cripple steel. The morning after the strike broke cold and merciless, the Atlantic calm but heavy with foreboding. The Bismarck rolled sluggishly in the long grey swells, her wake circling unnaturally as the jammed rudder held her in a slow, tragic spiral. The crew had worked through the night in the bitter rain, sparks flaring under tarpaulins, as welders fought against twisted steel and rising water. Every clang of hammer and hiss of torch echoed through the hull like a heartbeat fading with exhaustion. The corridors smelled of oil, sweat and despair, a blend that clung to every surface. Pumps droned endlessly, fighting a losing battle against the sea seeping in through seams and vents. "We'll get her straight again," one officer said quietly, though his voice carried little conviction. Men nodded because they had no other choice. But above, the wind began to shift, bringing with it a sound few dared to name, the distant hum of engines drawing closer. In the wireless room, the operators worked by candlelight, their faces pale beneath the flicker of flame. Static hissed across the receivers like whispers from ghosts, but through it came fragments of coded messages, urgent and uneven. "Enemy closing, bearing north-northwest, maintain silence." The operators exchanged glances but continued tapping, sending status reports to Berlin that would never bring relief. Rudder jammed, unable to steer, engines operational. Each word transmitted was another admission of fate. Sweat dripped onto the telegraph keys as one operator paused, his trembling hands hovering over the switch. "Should we stop?" he asked. "No," came the reply, flat and distant. Berlin must know. Outside the compartment, the sound of waves slapping the hull was relentless, indifferent. The wireless key resumed its rhythm, a heartbeat made of dots and dashes. Somewhere, far across the sea, someone was listening. Down in the steering compartment, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Men waded waist-deep in oily water, working by lantern light as the ship pitched and groaned above them. The rudder assembly was mangled beyond recognition, twisted steel bent by explosive force into shapes that defied repair. Welding torches sputtered, their glow reflecting on faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. "We'll have to cut through," shouted a chief mechanic, his words drowned by the noise of pumps. Sparks flew like fireflies as steel met steel, but progress was slow and cruelly uncertain. Above them, officers shouted orders down the hatch, their voices tense but helpless. The ship listed again, and a wave of water surged through the compartment, drenching tools and extinguishing flames. A moment of silence followed, filled only by the hiss of leaking pipes. Someone whispered, "She won't turn." No one argued. On the bridge, Ditchen stood motionless, his gloved hands clasped behind his back as he stared into the horizon that offered nothing but grey. Rain beaded on the windows, tracing slow, deliberate lines down the glass. Lindemann joined him, his face drawn and pale beneath his cap, his uniform damp with salt. "We can still make it to France," he said quietly, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Lutjens nodded, his gaze never leaving the waves. "We will fight to the last shell," he murmured, almost to himself. Neither man spoke of surrender. It was a word forbidden aboard the Bismarck. The crew looked to them for strength, and in return they offered calm, not of hope, but of duty fulfilled. Outside, the sea seemed endless again, vast and cruel, yet somewhere within that emptiness, the hunters were drawing near. To the west, British cruisers cut through the waves in tight formation, their bows smashing aside the sea with cold precision. Aboard HMS Norfolk and Suffolk, the radar screens glowed faintly in the dark, the steady sweep of the beam finding echoes where none should be. "Contact bearing 090, a technician announced, his voice tight with disbelief. Officers crowded around the display, eyes narrowing as the blip reappeared, then vanished, then returned again. The room buzzed with tension, the air electric with certainty and doubt in equal measure. "It's her," the captain said finally, a simple truth that silenced the room. Orders rippled through the decks, boots striking metal as the ship turned to intercept. The smell of hot steel filled the air as engines thundered to life. On the horizon, faint and distant, the shadow of a wounded Titan drifted in circles, alone against the grey. The trap had begun to close. Inside Bismarck, word spread quickly. Enemy contact confirmed. The announcement came through the intercom, like the tolling of a bell. Men exchanged brief looks but said nothing. They had no illusions left, only tasks. Gun crews checked their mounts, loaders moved shells, medics prepared stretchers, though few expected to use them again. In the mess, sailors scribbled letters they would never send, folding them neatly into pockets as if ritual could stop time. The ship vibrated with life and death intertwined, the deep hum of her engines, now the pulse of inevitability. "We're still the Bismarck," one petty officer said fiercely, gripping a railing until his knuckles whitened. Another nodded, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion deeper than fear. Outside, the sea grew darker as clouds thickened once more, swallowing the light. The day was ending, and with it, perhaps, everything else. The weather turned again, a bitter wind cutting across the deck and driving sheets of rain sideways. Lookouts strained their eyes through binoculars, wiping lenses every few seconds, searching for shapes that appeared and vanished with each swell. Lightning flickered to the north, revealing silhouettes that seemed to move with purpose. "Ships," someone whispered. The alarm bells clanged again, their echo running through every corridor. The guns elevated automatically, barrels gleaming wet in the stormlight, though their targets were still shadows in mist. Below decks, men rushed to ammunition lockers, boots slamming against ladders as voices shouted above the wind. The Bismarck's searchlights remained dark. There was no point in revealing what the enemy already knew. On the bridge, Lindemann adjusted his cap, his face lit only by the soft glow of instruments. "They're coming," he said simply, and no one disagreed. In the British fleet, anticipation thickened into near silence. Aboard HMS King George V, Admiral Tovey leaned over his plotting table, the lamplight turning the lines on his face into maps of their own. "She's lost steering," he murmured. "She's finished." Around him officers nodded grimly, marking new positions and confirming distances. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and tobacco, the aroma of command under pressure. On the deck, sailors moved in near silence, securing lines and checking weapons with mechanical precision. The ships advanced through the rain like predators in formation, their wakes slicing white against the Black Sea. "We'll engage at dawn," Tovey ordered, and his voice carried the weight of centuries of naval tradition. Beyond the bridge windows, thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. Every man aboard knew what the morning would bring. The Royal Navy was not hunting anymore. It was executing sentence. Back aboard Bismarck, the officers gathered one last time around the chart table. The compass spun aimlessly, its needle trembling under the magnetic interference of damaged circuits. Rain hammered against the windows as Lindemann reviewed the reports, his voice low but steady, steering unresponsive. Speed 15 knots. Enemy approaching from northwest. The men listened in silence, each line an obituary written in operational language. "We'll continue to fight," Lutjens said. "We are soldiers. We die as such." His words were neither defiant nor emotional. They were simply fact. The others nodded, their faces shadowed by the dim red light of the bridge. Outside, the sea had grown black, its surface whipped white by the wind. In the distance, faint flashes marked where the horizon ended. Lightning or enemy guns, no one could yet tell. The night felt long enough to hold eternity. By midnight, the Bismarck's engines still turned, but her spirit had begun to fade. The rain softened to mist, and the waves calmed into a heavy, rhythmic swell that seemed almost merciful. Men stood by their posts in silence, the hum of machinery the only sound between them. Some prayed, others smoked in defiance of regulations, each man lost in his own thoughts. Above, the British fleet closed the ring, their lights hidden, their guns ready. The ocean, vast and endless, had become smaller with every hour. There would be no escape now, no miracle left to summon. The Atlantic had swallowed empires before, but tonight it would claim something different, a monument to ambition, pride, and courage. The horizon was empty yet full of waiting. The Atlantic had become her prison, vast, merciless, and final. Night fell slowly over the Atlantic, heavy and deliberate, like a curtain being drawn over the final act of a tragedy already decided. The sea was calm for the first time in days, its dark surface breathing in long, slow swells that caught faint reflections of the stars. The Bismarck moved in wide, helpless circles, her engines still beating like the heart of something too proud to die. The air smelled of salt, oil, and rain long past, heavy with the memory of storms and battle. The crew spoke little now, their voices hushed to whispers, as if words might draw the enemy nearer. The decks gleamed faintly with moisture, every step echoing through the hull like a ghost's footfall. Below, the great turbines throbbed softly, their rhythm now a lullaby of inevitability. Men passed each other in corridors without meeting eyes, nodding once, acknowledging both duty and fate. The ship, once a symbol of defiance, had become a cathedral of silence, and in that silence, the last night began. In the mess hall, the clatter of plates and laughter that once filled the air had long vanished, replaced by a quiet that bordered on reverence. Men sat in small groups, their meals untouched, the flicker of lanterns painting their faces in shades of bronze and shadow. Some smoked, the faint glow of their cigarettes, the only light between them, curling smoke rising to meet the low ceiling. A few wrote letters by the dim light of a bulb that swayed with the ship's motion, their handwriting shaky but careful. They wrote to wives, to children, to mothers they hadn't seen since the war began. "We fought bravely," one man murmured as he folded his note, "and now we rest." No one replied. The air smelled of tobacco, ink, and the faint tang of wet wool. Someone began humming softly, a tune without words soon fading into the hum of the engines. Time itself seemed to hesitate, unwilling to move forward. The sea waited with them. On the bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann stood motionless before the chart table, his face half lit by the soft red glow of the instruments. His uniform was damp at the collar, the salt from spray-dried white against the black wool. He had not slept in nearly 2 days, but his voice remained calm, his orders few and clear. "Maintain course," he said, though the rudder was still fixed, a command given out of habit rather than hope. Behind him, officers worked quietly, recording bearings and checking rangefinders, their gestures slow and deliberate. Lindemann glanced through the rain-streaked glass toward the horizon, where faint lightning still flickered far to the north. He knew the British would attack at dawn. He knew the sea that had hidden them would now betray them in morning light. Still, he stood straight, his posture a final act of dignity in the face of ruin. The ship creaked softly, as if listening, and for a long while no one spoke. In the lower decks, the sound of pumps had become part of the atmosphere, a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed beneath every conversation. Men gathered near the bulkheads, warming their hands over small heating pipes and trading quiet words. "Do you think they'll let us surrender?" one asked. "No," another replied without anger. "Not after Hood." The words hung in the air, honest and heavy, and the conversation ended there. A mechanic, his face streaked with grease, wiped his hands on a rag and stared at the deck. "At least we're not freezing," he muttered, forcing a smile. No one returned. Somewhere deeper below, the wounded stirred in their bunks, murmuring in fevered dreams. The air was thick and warm, carrying the mixed scents of metal, sweat, and disinfectant. Above them, boots echoed faintly on the decks. The Bismarck was still alive, but she was breathing slower now, as if each turn of her propellers came at great cost. Lütjen sat alone in his cabin, the door closed, the only sound the steady tick of a clock mounted on the wall. His uniform jacket lay neatly folded on the chair beside him, his medals still polished though no one would see them again. On the desk a single lamp burned low, illuminating a half-finished letter to his family. The paper trembled slightly with each vibration of the engines beneath. His handwriting was precise, the tone formal, yet there was a softness in the final line. "Whatever happens, remember I did my duty." He read it once more, then folded it carefully, sealing it with the wax at hand. Outside, footsteps passed, but no one disturbed him. For a moment he allowed himself the rare indulgence of silence without command. He looked toward the porthole where the reflection of his face merged with the endless night beyond. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and stepped into the corridor. On the open deck, the wind had softened to a whisper, carrying the faint smell of seaweed and burnt fuel. Lindemann walked slowly along the starboard rail, the metal cold beneath his gloved hand. Above him, the stars stretched in infinite stillness, sharp and clear through the thinning clouds. The moonlight cast a silver sheen across the Atlantic, turning every ripple into glass. For the first time in days, the sea seemed calm, as if exhausted by its own fury. He paused by the forward turret, where a lone sailor stood watch, his silhouette framed against the dim horizon. "A quiet night," Lindemann said softly. "Yes, Captain," the man replied, his voice barely audible. They stood together for a moment, saying nothing more. The stars reflected faintly in the officer's eyes. Not hope, not fear, but acceptance. Somewhere far away, thunder rumbled, like distant drums. Below deck, the ship's chapel had become a refuge. A handful of sailors knelt on the wooden benches, their helmets resting beside them, the faint light from a swinging bulb casting shadows across the crucifix at the front. The priest, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, whispered words of comfort that few truly heard. "God be with those at sea," he said, his tone calm, steady, practiced. The men bowed their heads, hands folded or clasped together, some out of faith, others out of habit. The low hum of the engines filled the pauses between his words like an amen of steel. One man began to cry quietly, his shoulders shaking though no one looked his way. The priest closed his book and crossed himself, his hand trembling slightly. "Go in peace," he said, though peace was nowhere near. When they stood again, they did so as soldiers, quiet, resolute, and ready. Midnight passed unnoticed, marked only by a change of watch and the distant thrum of the engines. The ship moved through the dark in wide, slow arcs, her wake a ghostly ribbon under the stars. The air was damp, thick with salt and heavy with the metallic taste of tension. In the radio room, operators sat in near silence, headphones pressed to their ears, listening to the static hum of the ether. "Enemy still tracking," one whispered, though the words seemed redundant now. The messages from Berlin had stopped hours earlier. There would be no rescue, no reinforcements. The only sound was the endless crackle of distance, the voice of an ocean that offered no reply. One operator leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, imagining land, a street, a home, a life before steel and salt water. The fantasy dissolved as quickly as it formed. Duty remained, and duty was all that was left. The early hours crept slowly across the Atlantic, the horizon still dark but softening at its edge. The temperature dropped again, the air sharp and cold enough to sting the lungs. On deck, the few still awake moved like shadows, their breath rising in clouds that glowed faintly under the dim deck lamps. The guns loomed silent, their barrels pointing into the night as if waiting for the light to summon purpose. Somewhere aft, a phonograph played quietly, its record crackling as a German waltz drifted through the corridors, haunting, tender, absurdly beautiful. A few men smiled at the sound, others frowned, unable to decide if it comforted or mocked them. The song ended abruptly as the needle reached its end, the silence afterward deeper than before. The ship rolled gently as though sighing. Dawn was coming, and with it the reckoning they all felt in their bones. By the final hour before sunrise, the Bismarck had settled into an unnatural stillness, her movements almost graceful against the faint light of the east. Every man aboard knew what the morning would bring, though none spoke of it. The sea was calm, the sky faintly pink at the edges, the world holding its breath before violence. Lindemann returned to the bridge, his boots echoing on the deck, his face unreadable but calm. Around him, his officers took their stations without command, each one knowing the motions by heart. Somewhere below, a kettle hissed quietly, a mundane sound in a world stripped of the ordinary. The captain looked once more through the glass, his reflection blending with the sea beyond. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cap, and gave one final nod. No speeches were made, no prayers spoken, only the steady heartbeat of a ship awaiting dawn. Dawn broke red over the Atlantic, bleeding across the waves like a warning written in light. The sea, calm only hours before, seemed to awaken with the rising sun, each ripple trembling as distant thunder rolled across the horizon. From the east came the silhouettes of giants, HMS Rodney and King George V, their guns already turning toward the lone figure that drifted in slow circles. The Bismarck, her flag still raised and guns poised, awaited them in silence. The air was heavy, metallic, charged with the scent of salt and oil. On board, men took their positions without orders, the rhythm of duty carrying them through fear. Shells were loaded, rangefinders adjusted, prayers whispered under breath. "Ready, main battery," came the voice from the bridge, low and steady, and with the first ray of full daylight, the world exploded into sound. The British opened fire at 0847 hours, their first salvos flashing orange against the grey sea, the roar travelling across the water like rolling thunder. The shells came whistling through the air, a sound so sharp it cut through thought itself. When they struck, the sea erupted around Bismarck in walls of spray taller than her towers. The ship shuddered, the deck trembling under the concussive shock. "Hit to port," someone shouted. The words lost to the next explosion. The air filled with smoke, hot and acrid, stinging eyes and throats. Still, her guns answered. Deep, guttural blasts that seemed to shake the ocean itself. The massive shells soared high, glowing faintly in the rising sun before vanishing into the mist. Each impact on the enemy horizon was met with another thunderclap of reply. The ocean had become a forge, and both sides hammered with everything they had left. Inside Bismarck's gun turrets, the world narrowed to light, noise, and heat. The gunners worked like automatons, their bodies moving in rhythm with the loaders and shell hoists. Sweat-streaked faces black with soot, and the air grew thick with cordite smoke until breathing itself became a labor. The guns recoiled with every shot, the vibration shaking teeth and bones. Metal screamed under stress, the entire ship groaning as if protesting the violence being forced upon her. "Maintain fire," the turret commander yelled, his voice breaking under the roar. Above, fragments of steel and splinters rained down from near misses, cutting through the air like hail. The temperature climbed until even gloves could not shield the heat of the casings. Still, they fired, blind, deaf, relentless. Each shell was both vengeance and farewell. From the decks of the British battleships, the scene looked almost unreal, a ship wreathed in smoke, refusing to die. Rodney's guns fired again and again, the recoil shaking the entire vessel as shells the size of small cars arced toward their target. "Range 22,000, shouted the range officer, his voice steady amid chaos. The gunners adjusted and fired, their faces lit orange with every flash of muzzle flame. Each round found its mark now, smashing through turrets, tearing through decks, ripping the Bismarck's armor like parchment. Flames leapt skyward as one turret fell silent, its roof peeled open by impact. The air filled with the crackle of burning paint and the hiss of steam bursting from ruptured pipes. Through binoculars, British officers saw flashes of counterfire still coming. Incredible, impossible. "She's still shooting," one said quietly, almost in awe. Even now she fought back. On Bismarck's bridge, the windows were shattered, glass glittering across the deck like frost. Lindemann stood at the helm, his coat blackened by smoke, his voice a calm center amid the storm. "Target bearing, fire," he commanded, though the rangefinders were barely functional. Around him, instruments sparked, panels hung loose, and the walls shuddered with every hit. Reports poured in from below, turret Dora destroyed, engine room taking water, fire in forward compartment. Yet the captain's tone never changed. He gripped the railing as if it anchored him to reason itself. Luchin stood beside him, silent now, watching the sky tear open with flame. A fragment of steel crashed through the bulkhead, sending sparks across the floor, but neither man flinched. The command room glowed red with firelight and determination. Above them, the ensign still flew, ragged but unbroken. Below decks, chaos had no shape, only sound. Men ran through smoke-filled corridors, dragging hoses, carrying wounded, shouting through the din. The air was thick with heat and choking soot, every breath tasting of ash and metal. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, turning hallways into scalding fog. The deck tilted again, sending loose shells rolling and tools clattering into the dark. Flooding aft, a voice screamed, followed by the thunderous sound of water bursting through bulkheads. Sparks fell like rain from damaged cables, flickering over pools of oil that caught fire in seconds. Amid the chaos, a medic knelt beside a wounded man, pressing a rag to a wound that would not close. "Hold on," he whispered, though they both knew he wouldn't. The ship trembled with another hit, the sound vibrating through their bones. Every compartment was becoming its own battlefield. Outside, the sea itself seemed to burn. Shells struck so close that geysers of water fell back as rain, coating everything in salt and smoke. The Bismarck superstructure was a twisted silhouette, now her once proud lines obscured by flame and ruin. Yet her guns, at least those still alive, continued to roar. The sound carried through the storm of steel, a deep, angry voice that refused silence. "She's still firing," a British sailor murmured aboard King George V, awe softening the edge of victory. Around him, the decks vibrated with recoil as their guns answered in kind. The horizon flashed again and again, a strobe of destruction where night and day collided. Smoke rolled thick across the sea, blotting out sky and water alike. The Atlantic itself seemed to recoil from the violence of man. By mid-morning, the Bismarck was a shadow of herself, her turrets silent, her decks shattered. Fires raged unchecked, licking at the sky, their glow reflected in the oil-slicked water below. The list to port grew steeper. Every groan of the hull, another sign of surrender forced by physics, not will. Lindemann still stood at his post, surrounded by the wreckage of command, his face expressionless but composed. "Cease fire," someone whispered, but he didn't hear. A shell struck forward, blowing open the deck and sending a column of smoke high into the grey air. The ship answered once more, a single gun firing almost out of instinct. The echo rolled across the waves and was swallowed by the thunder of her enemies. Then, for the first time that morning, the Bismarck fell quiet. The silence felt wrong, heavier than the sound it replaced. Aboard the British ships, the firing slowed, then ceased. The smoke cleared gradually, revealing what remained, a drifting fortress torn open from bow to stern, her guns twisted and lifeless. "She's finished," an officer said softly, lowering his binoculars. Around him, men removed their caps, the silence aboard Rodney as profound as that aboard the dying enemy. The sea, once filled with violence, now carried only the smell of smoke and burning oil. For a moment, no one spoke, not even in triumph. There was only the realization that they had destroyed something greater than a ship. They had ended an era of illusion. Waves slapped gently against the side of the sinking giant, as if trying to soothe her. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. The battle was over, though its echo would never fade. On Bismarck's decks, the flames burned low as seawater began to claim the wounded steel. Men clung to rails, to debris, to memory itself as the ship slowly began to heal. The Atlantic swallowed the sounds of machinery, leaving only wind and water. The last flag still fluttered at the masthead, tattered but visible through the haze. Lindemann was last seen near the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the sea with unbroken calm. "It's been an honor," he said, to no one and everyone at once. The deck tilted again, faster now, the sound of breaking metal rising like thunder. Men leapt into the cold water, their cries fading quickly into distance. Within minutes, the Bismarck was gone, leaving only smoke, oil, and the slow roll of the sea. Surrounded by thunder, the giant roared one last time, defiant even in ruin. The sea was calm as the Bismarck began to die, her engines still turning slowly in the depths, though the bridge above had already fallen silent. The great hull, once a symbol of perfection in steel, was now torn and gutted. Her deck split open like the ribs of a wounded leviathan. Smoke curled into the grey sky in thin, exhausted plumes that drifted away like memory itself. Waves slapped against the list of her flank, carrying pieces of wreckage that still burned with faint orange glow. Inside the ship, water rushed through broken compartments, swallowing rooms once filled with command and purpose. The air smelled of oil and cordite, of seawater and despair. Every light flickered, the electricity sputtering as circuits drowned. The deck tilted further, slow at first, then faster as gravity began its claim. Steel groaned under its own weight, echoing through the hull like the moan of a dying giant. The sea had waited long enough. Now it was coming to take her. In the engine rooms, men worked by instinct alone, surrounded by steam and choking heat. The gauges were shattered, the dials useless. Yet still they watched them as if obedience could hold back the flood. Water burst through bulkheads in silver sheets, spraying across the machinery that had once driven a nation's pride. The floor trembled underfoot, the vibration no longer steady but chaotic, desperate. "Shut it down," someone shouted, though the order came too late. Boilers hissed violently as cold seawater met white-hot pipes, sending scalding mist through the air. Men coughed and stumbled. Hands burned, faces blackened, lungs filling with steam. The lights blinked once, then went dark, leaving only the red glow of emergency lanterns dancing through the haze. Somewhere above, the sound of collapsing metal roared through the decks like a mountain breaking apart. The Bismarck's heart, once the proudest in the Atlantic, had stopped beating. On the bridge there was no longer command, only survival. The windows were gone, the chart table overturned, the compass still spinning uselessly in its shattered frame. Lindemann stood near the railing, his uniform burned and soaked, his cap gone. The horizon before him was a pale blur, the sky and sea indistinguishable in their greyness. Below, sailors rushed across slanting decks, their boots slipping on oil and blood. "Abandon ship," came the cry, carried half by voice, half by the wind. The words moved faster than sound, spreading through every corridor, every compartment. Men hesitated only a moment, glancing back toward the flag, still fluttering weakly in the smoke. Then they ran, not out of fear, but because even courage has limits. Behind them the sea roared in. At the midships, sailors clung to the rails as the list grew steeper, their world tilting toward chaos. The smell of oil was overpowering now, thick and nauseating, clinging to every surface. Waves broke over the gunwales, sweeping men from their footing into the cold embrace below. Some jumped willingly, arms outstretched, their cries swallowed instantly by the wind. Others froze in place, paralyzed by disbelief, their fingers white against the steel they had served. Flames licked along the deck, carried by spilled fuel, their orange tongues contrasting the dull grey of dawn. "Overboard!" someone shouted again, voice raw with salt and smoke. One by one, figures plunged into the water, their bodies disappearing amid foam and wreckage. Above them, the great ship's guns hung silent, staring into the sky like monuments of regret. The Atlantic showed no mercy, only depth. In the freezing water, chaos reigned without sound. The cold struck like knives, cutting through uniform and skin in seconds, stealing breath before screams could form. Oil spread across the surface, black and iridescent, burning the eyes and coating every movement with slick futility. Men thrashed among floating debris, beams, lifebelts, the remnants of a world built to defy this very fate. The smell of smoke mixed with salt and iron, the taste of survival turning bitter on every tongue. Voices called out for help in German, English, and prayer alike, echoing across the empty sea. Some found rafts clinging with trembling hands to fragments of what had once been strength. Others drifted, faces pale against the black water, staring up at the sky that gave no answers. The Bismarck loomed above them, still, tilling, turning, falling. Then her bow rose like the beginning of a scream, and she began to slide beneath. The ship went down slowly at first, her stern lifting toward the heavens as her weight pulled against the deep. The sound was indescribable. The groan of tearing metal, the crash of collapsing decks, the final exhalation of trapped air bursting through 1,000 seams. Water poured across her surfaces in shining rivers as the ocean swallowed its creation whole. Men watched from the waves, their faces lit by the glow of fires still burning on the water's surface. The great propellers, visible for an instant, gleamed briefly in the light before vanishing into darkness. "She's going," someone whispered, their voice trembling not with fear but awe. Within moments, the last of her disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only smoke and oil to mark the grave. The suction pulled at the survivors, dragging some downward into the cold black void. Then, as suddenly as it began, there was silence. That silence was broken only by the sea itself, the slap of waves, the hiss of bubbles, the slow drift of wreckage. The survivors floated in small groups, their breath shallow, their eyes glassy from cold and shock. The oil slick coated everything, turning the water to a mirror of black glass that reflected nothing but ruin. Bodies drifted by, faces half submerged, hands reaching for life belts that no longer mattered. Somewhere, a sailor sang softly, the melody fragile against the vastness of the Atlantic. It lasted only seconds before fading into the wind. The survivors clung to anything that floated, planks, barrels, fragments of the ship's soul. The horizon was empty, and the air stung their lungs like fire. They had escaped the fire only to meet the cold. The ocean was quiet again, as if it had finished its work. Hours later, a shape appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette cutting through the haze. HMS Dorsetshire approached cautiously, her crew scanning the water for signs of life amid the wreckage. The cries of the survivors carried faintly across the waves, growing clearer as the destroyer drew nearer. "There!" shouted a lookout, pointing toward the oil-slicked patch where dozens still clung to debris. Boats were lowered quickly, men rowing through the thick water that reeked of diesel and death. "Hold on," they called, their voices strong but faces grim. One by one, the survivors were pulled aboard, soaked, shivering, eyes hollow. They were offered blankets and brandy, but most were too cold to speak. Above them, the British sailors watched in silence, the enormity of victory suddenly unbearable. The war had many triumphs. This was not one of them. Only 115 men would live to see the sun again. The rest, more than 2,000 souls, lay below, entombed in the steel coffin that rested on the ocean floor. The Dorsetshire lingered only briefly, aware that U-boats might already be on their way. "We can't stay," the captain said, though his voice was heavy with reluctance. The boats were hauled back, ropes coiled and engines brought to life. The survivors huddled together, their eyes fixed on the spot where the sea still churned faintly with oil. The smell of smoke lingered on the wind, mingling with salt and sorrow. As the destroyer turned away, the horizon seemed to close like a curtain over a stage that had seen enough tragedy. The Atlantic rolled on, indifferent to memory or loss. Beneath it, the Bismarck settled into darkness, her guns silent forever. The sea returned to stillness, as it always does, carrying no trace of the thunder that had shaken it hours before. The sun rose higher, pale and cold, glinting off the floating wreckage that drifted without direction. Gulls circled overhead, their cries harsh against the quiet. The British fleet moved away, their mission complete, their decks slick with rain and reflection. For the men who survived on both sides, the memory would never fade, burned into dreams with the weight of fire and water. The Atlantic stretched endlessly once more, its grey expanse covering everything it had taken. Time would move on, but this patch of sea would remain marked by silence. Somewhere below, in the deep cold where light no longer reached, the Bismarck lay still, proud even in ruin, waiting for history to remember. In minutes, pride turned to wreckage, and the Atlantic closed its grey curtain upon them all. The Atlantic had fallen silent by the time the last echoes of gunfire drifted away. The water, once alive with smoke and thunder, now lay heavy and grey beneath a sky veiled in mist. The wreckage of war floated like a broken constellation, planks, oil drums, lifebelts, and the silent forms of men who had fought until the end. The sea carried them gently, rocking them in its slow and endless rhythm. For the sailors of HMS Dorsetshire, the victory was already hollow, its weight pressing deeper than triumph could ever reach. The decks smelled of salt and diesel, mingled with something metallic and mournful. Survivors from the Bismarck huddled against the cold, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on nothing. British sailors offered blankets and cups of tea with shaking hands, uncertain whether pity or duty guided them. The guns were still warm, yet no one spoke of victory. The ocean had swallowed too much to celebrate. On Dorsetshire's deck, the rescued Germans sat wrapped in wool and silence. Their bodies trembled from shock and cold, but their expressions were unreadable, the blankness of men who had seen the world end and somehow remained. One young officer stared endlessly at the horizon, where smoke still stained the sky in faint streaks. He whispered names beneath his breath, names that would never answer again. The British medics worked quietly among them, binding wounds and offering brandy, though none of it could reach the places truly broken. Around them the Atlantic stretched wide and grey, a mirror reflecting their exhaustion. There were too few to save, one sailor muttered as he looked across the waves still slick with oil. The sound of the engines was the only heartbeat left aboard. The smell of salt, blood and iron filled the morning air. The line between enemy and survivor had dissolved into shared humanity. Below decks the atmosphere was heavy, as though the very steel remembered the battle. The rescued were given hammocks, dry clothes, and silence. A courtesy more profound than words. A British officer took down their names, his pen trembling as he wrote through translation and trauma. Each name felt like an elegy, a fragment of something far larger now resting on the ocean floor. One sailor, barely 19, clutched a photograph of his family, its edges burned and salt-stained. "Si Sindello tot," he whispered. "They are all dead." The officer paused, pen frozen mid-air, and could only nod. Across the ship, the constant hum of the engines filled every pause, every breath. Somewhere aft, a gun turret groaned as it cooled, the metal still expanding and settling from the heat of battle. Even victory sounded like mourning. Messages flew across the fleet that morning, short, clipped, heavy with finality. Bismarck sunk. Survivors aboard Dorsetshire. Each word carried the echo of thunder and fire that had filled the previous hours. Aboard HMS King George V, officers read the signal in silence, their faces grim beneath the low grey sky. The Admiral stood alone for a moment on deck, the wind whipping at his coat, eyes fixed on the endless water. "We've done our duty," someone said softly behind him, but no one replied. Around him men moved with the precision of exhaustion, cleaning the guns, coiling the ropes, and washing the decks where soot still clung like memory. Even the sea seemed subdued, its waves breaking gently against the hull. Somewhere far below, the wreck rested in the darkness, its flag still entangled in twisted steel. The war had claimed another monument to pride. The silence that followed felt eternal. In Berlin, the news arrived like a blow no propaganda could soften. Radio operators whispered it first, the words spreading through corridors before anyone dared to confirm. The Bismarck, the invincible, the proud, was gone. At the Naval High Command, officers stood motionless around a single telegram, its black ink bleeding into their understanding of reality. Ship lost, heavy casualties, cause, enemy action. Grand Admiral Raeder read the report twice before setting it down, his hand shaking despite years of discipline. Outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that a symbol of its strength had just been erased. A secretary crossed herself quietly, the only sound in the room the ticking of a clock. The message was forwarded to Hitler, who received it without expression. "Impossible," he muttered, before walking away into silence. In that moment, the myth of invincibility finally cracked. Across Germany, disbelief spread faster than mourning. Newspapers printed cautious lines about missing contact and uncertain circumstances, even as the truth was already known. Families waited at doorsteps for letters that would never come. In shipyards, engineers who had built the Bismarck stood by their machinery in stunned quiet, their creation gone before its legend had even matured. "She was our pride," one foreman said, his voice breaking like the metal he once shaped. At naval academies, instructors avoided speaking of her, fearing to ignite questions with no answers. The loss was more than strategic, it was spiritual, a wound to the illusion of mastery that had fueled the Reich's ambition. Every rivet, every gun, every dream of dominance lay now beneath the Atlantic. Even the most hardened officers found themselves staring at the sea on maps as if it had turned traitor. The Empire had lost more than a ship, it had lost belief. Back aboard the Dorsetshire, the rescued sailors began to speak. Quietly, cautiously, between coughs and tremors, they told of the order, "We fight to the last shell." The words of Admiral Lütjens that had echoed through the decks before communication was lost. He stood tall, one recalled, eyes distant. He didn't flinch when the bridge was hit. Another described the captain, Lindemann, standing at the helm until the very end, his voice calm amid chaos. These stories spread among the British sailors who listened in stunned silence. The enemy had been brave, perhaps even noble, and that truth carried a strange discomfort. "They went down fighting," one seaman whispered, his gaze lost to the grey horizon. The conversation ended there, not out of disrespect, but reverence. The war demanded enemies, but the sea made equals of them all. The fleet regrouped slowly, turning back towards safer waters as the last survivors were counted. The sea that had raged with violence now lay unnaturally calm, as though the ocean itself were exhausted. Ships moved cautiously through the slick of oil that still marked the place of the battle, their wakes spreading like faint scars. On deck, officers sent final messages home, brief, formal, and strangely hollow. "Bismarck destroyed. Mission complete." Yet the words carried no triumph, only a weary acceptance that something vast and human had ended there. The younger sailors lingered at the rails, watching the grey water slide past. Somewhere beneath those waves 2,000 men slept without markers or graves. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, pale and indifferent. Then it disappeared again, leaving only shadow. The Atlantic swallowed its secret whole. By evening, the Dorsetshire's survivors began to recover, wrapped in layers of wool and memory. Some slept for the first time in days, their dreams haunted by noise and flame. Others sat awake, staring into the dim light, whispering prayers that had no borders or flags. The British sailors avoided conversation. the shared understanding too heavy for words, coffee steamed in tin mugs, the warmth doing little against the chill that clung to every thought. Above deck, the sea stretched endlessly, silver and indifferent under the fading sun. The horizon was clear now, free of smoke or fire, an emptiness that felt too pure to trust. Somewhere gulls cried, their voices faint against the hum of engines. The war would continue, but something elemental had ended here. The sea was quiet again, but in its depths it carried the echo of an empire's final cry. London awoke to the news beneath a sky veiled in rain. Bismarck sunk, the headlines declared in bold letters that carried both triumph and fatigue. Radios crackled in bakeries and bus depots, voices speaking of vengeance and valor over the hum of daily life. Crowds gathered near newsstands, their umbrellas forming black constellations across the wet pavement. Yet beneath the cheers lay something quieter, a sense that victory had come at a cost no one could yet measure. The names of the dead from HMS Hood were still being read in homes that had gone silent. Mothers stared at the paper, at the neat lists of rank and number, not the men they remembered. The bells that rang in celebration also told in mourning. In offices and pubs toasts were raised with trembling hands. The rain fell harder, washing the streets clean of the ink that proclaimed success. Britain had won, but the sound of the sea still haunted its conscience. In his study at Downing Street, Winston Churchill read the telegram beneath the steady flame of his lamp. Bismarck sunk by combined fleet action, it said. The words exact, almost cold in their formality. He exhaled deeply, the weight of relief settling heavier than expected. For days he had paced, demanding hourly reports, his mind tethered to the chase across the Atlantic. "We've got her," someone had said over the phone, but Churchill did not smile. Instead, he poured a measure of whiskey, staring into the glass as if it might show him the faces of the lost. "The Hood," he murmured softly, setting the telegram down. Smoke from his cigar curled upward, slow and somber. Outside, Big Ben struck noon, its chimes echoing across a city still uncertain whether to rejoice or grieve. The war had delivered a victory, yes, but not without reminding its victor of the void that followed vengeance. Aboard British ships returning from the Atlantic, the atmosphere was subdued, solemn. Sailors leaned on the rails, staring at the grey expanse of water where the Bismarck had vanished, the oil still shimmering faintly in the distance. "She was a fine ship," one gunner said, his voice hushed as though speaking in church. Another nodded, fingers tracing the railing where paint still bore the marks of battle. The decks were slick with seawater and smoke residue, a faint metallic tang hanging in the air. No songs were sung, no cheers exchanged. Instead, men moved slowly, their movements marked by exhaustion more emotional than physical. In the mess hall, someone placed a single photograph of HMS Hood above the galley door, and no one spoke beneath it. They had avenged her, but revenge brought no warmth. Outside, gulls followed the ship, circling endlessly above the grey wake. The Atlantic was calm now, as if ashamed of what it had witnessed. In naval bases from Scapa Flow to Portsmouth, flags were lowered to half-mast. The signal enemy battleship destroyed rippled through communication rooms like a heartbeat, long awaited. Yet in the same moment, memorial services began aboard the fleet, chaplains standing on wet decks, reading prayers that the wind carried into the open sea. At Portsmouth, a bugler played the last post, the sound piercing through mist and salt air. Families gathered at the docks, clutching letters sent before the battle, their edges already soft from touch. "He wrote that he'd be home for summer," one woman said, her words vanishing into the hum of the harbour. Around her, others wept quietly, the grief dignified, restrained as British grief often was. In the churchyards, bells tolled for Hood's crew of 1,415 souls. Victory had been delivered not by triumph but by sacrifice, and that truth would linger long after the guns had gone silent. War correspondents filed their reports with the precision of witnesses burdened by awe. In radio studios, announcers spoke in tones that balanced pride with reverence. "The mighty Bismarck has been destroyed," one said, pausing before continuing softly, "avenging the loss of HMS Hood." Across Britain, listeners held their breath in kitchens and parlours, the words threading into the quiet between heartbeats. Newspapers the next morning printed the story alongside photographs of sailors, their faces ghostly in the glare of flashbulbs, the captions read of courage and duty. But between the lines ran a different current, fatigue, perhaps even pity. Editorials called the victory a turning of tides, though no one dared call it joy. The sea, that old and endless judge, had merely balanced its scales once more. Outside the printing presses, dawn broke pale and cold. The ink of history was still wet. In Parliament, Churchill stood before the House, his words carrying the gravitas of both triumph and sorrow. "The Bismarck is sunk," he announced, "and justice for the Hood is done." Applause filled the chamber, but he raised a hand, halting it before it could grow into celebration. "Let us not forget those who lie beneath the waves," he added quietly. And in that instant, even the most hardened politicians bowed their heads. Behind him, aides shuffled papers, their eyes avoiding his. For a moment, the roar of London outside seemed distant, replaced by the memory of the Atlantic's deep silence. The Prime Minister's voice softened, almost breaking. "This is not the end," he said, "but it is a reminder. The sea takes what it must." The session adjourned in solemn quiet, the weight of his words pressing heavy on every man there. Victory, he knew, was never clean. Among the sailors of the Royal Navy, pride and melancholy shared the same breath. Some spoke of Bismarck's courage, of how she fought until nothing remained, a strange respect forming for the enemy they had destroyed. "She went down fighting," one petty officer said, "and so did we." Others avoided the subject altogether, preferring to scrub decks and coil lines in silence. At night, when the ships anchored in calm waters, men stared at the stars reflected in the sea, wondering how many eyes still looked up from below. The war continued, but for these men something essential had changed. The understanding that steel and will alone did not define victory. They had witnessed the line where duty met mortality and could not forget it. The Atlantic's chill had seeped into their bones. They had won the battle but lost something nameless in themselves. Far from the sea, in small coastal villages, the bells of local churches rang unevenly, half for triumph, half for the fallen. Fishermen stood by the harbour, caps in hand, listening to the news through the static of radios that hissed like wind over waves. "The Bismarck's gone," one murmured, "and so is the Hood." The others nodded, their eyes turned toward the horizon, as if expecting to see both ships rise again. Children asked what it meant, their parents giving answers too simple for the truth. Posters proclaiming victory at sea hung in shop windows, though few smiled as they passed them. The smell of salt drifted inland on the wind, carrying echoes of distant thunder. Britain had defended her honour, but the sea had exacted its toll. Every family near water knew what that meant. The ocean had claimed both sides equally. In the press offices of Fleet Street, editors debated how to write history without betraying emotion. The word glorious was struck through, grim replaced it. Headlines shifted from bold triumph to quiet reverence. The hunt ends read one, the subheading small but heavy: "The mighty Bismarck destroyed after Hood, avenged." Beneath the typeset, journalists sat in silence, aware they were documenting both victory and obituary. The story would be told for decades, yet always with the echo of loss beneath its surface. A young reporter watching the first editions roll off the presses whispered, "It doesn't feel like winning." His editor looked up briefly and nodded. "That's because it isn't," he replied. Outside, the city's lights glimmered faintly through the mist. The typewriters kept clattering, the sound of memory being forged from grief. As night fell over Britain, the radios quieted and the papers stopped their presses. In the homes of sailors, mothers and wives stared at empty chairs, the sound of the wind filling the space where voices once lived. On the mantelpieces, framed photographs glowed faintly in the firelight, faces smiling from a world untouched by war. The ocean stretched unseen beyond the cliffs, its waves rolling endlessly under the moonlight. It had taken Bismarck, and it had taken Hood, and it would take countless more before peace returned. Yet in that moment the nation stood still, victorious, yes, but humbled by the cost. In the silence there was pride, but there was also mourning. The war went on, and Britain prepared for what was still to come. Britain had avenged her dead, yet in doing so was reminded of how fragile victory truly is. The North Atlantic was calm that morning, a surface of endless grey stretching beneath low clouds that blurred horizon from sky. The research vessel Comma drifted slowly, its hull rising and falling with the long rhythmic swell of the open ocean. Below, nearly 3 miles down, lay a world untouched by light or air, a kingdom of silence. On board, scientists moved with careful purpose, their voices low, their steps measured. Screens glowed in the dim cabin light, painting faces with the ghostly green of sonar imagery. The hum of generators blended with the faint metallic creak of cables feeding into the deep. Dr. Robert Ballard stood over the monitors, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the faint returns emerging from the dark. Each blip on the screen carried history's heartbeat. "We're close," he murmured, more to the sea than to his crew. The search for the Bismarck was about to end where her story had begun, in the cold and unforgiving Atlantic. The sonar traced the seabed like a blind hand reaching through eternity. What appeared at first were shapeless ridges, dunes of silt sculpted by decades of current. Then faintly a structure began to emerge, angular, deliberate, too perfect to be nature. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ping of returning signals. The outlines formed slowly, the shape unmistakable even through distortion. A hull nearly 1,000 feet long resting on its keel, bow slightly upturned toward the surface. "It would never see again." "There she is," whispered one of the technicians, his voice breaking the stillness. Ballard said nothing, his expression held the weight of reverence rather than triumph. The ship lay as if asleep, dreaming beneath the immense pressure of time. Every second on the screen felt like unearthing a ghost. They had found not wreckage but remembrance. History had taken form once more in steel and shadow. Hours later the cameras were readied, robotic eyes descending through the blackness. The sea swallowed the lights one by one, each beam fading into the void until nothing remained but a narrow column of illumination sinking ever deeper. The pressure outside could crush a submarine like paper, yet the ship's steel body had endured it for nearly half a century. On the monitors, the descent registered in slow gradients from cobalt blue to midnight black. Passing 2,000 fathoms came the report, the numbers carrying a quiet awe. The deeper they went, the more absolute the silence became, until even the hum of machinery seemed sacrilegious. Then a faint reflection, a gleam of metal amid the darkness. The first glimpse of Bismarck's hull filled the screens, vast and ghostly, its surface still bearing the scars of battle. The crew leaned closer as though peering into the face of the past. The sea at last had given up its secret. The cameras moved forward slowly, their propellers whispering in the water. Light played across the wreck, revealing rivets, gun mounts and twisted railings cloaked in sediment. The Bismarck rested upright, her bow proud, her flagstaff long gone but her dignity intact. The seabed around her was littered with fragments, torn plates, shells, and the ghosts of machinery. Small fish glided through open hatches where sailors had once run for battle stations. "She's whole," Ballard said quietly, almost in disbelief. The pressure had claimed her decks but not her shape. The ocean had preserved what time might have destroyed. The ship seemed less a ruin than a monument, solemn, deliberate, eternal. The robotic arms extended their lights along the deck, illuminating the outlines of the great guns, still aimed toward horizons unseen. No movement, no sound, only the memory of thunder, long since spent. The abyss had become her final anchorage. The camera drifted across the main deck, its lens tracing the scars of war. Near the midsection, one of the massive gun turrets lay wrenched from its housing, its barrel half buried in silt like a monument toppled by gods. Scorch marks remained on the steel, blackened streaks that told of fire even here beneath the sea. Around it, fragments of human life, a boot, a cup, a rusted helmet, half covered in coral growth, whispered of stories unfinished. Each artifact was a sentence in a language only silence could translate. The light touched a porthole still sealed shut, its glass reflecting the beam like an unblinking eye. No one spoke as the images came through. The ship was sacred ground now. The ocean's hand had not erased the traces of struggle, only softened them. Every rivet seemed to hold breath, every scar a heartbeat. The Bismarck was no longer lost. She was eternal. Ballard stood before the monitors, his expression caught between wonder and sorrow. "She went down fighting," he said softly, echoing the words once spoken by those who had faced her. The room felt colder, as though the chill of the abyss had reached them through the screens. He ordered the cameras to sweep along the stern, where the damage from the torpedo had sealed her fate. The rudders, bent and frozen in their final position, told the last chapter of her defiance. There, at the very edge of visibility, rested the wound that had doomed a legend. "That's where she stopped turning," whispered one of the crew, unable to look away. The camera panned upward once more, revealing the ship's vast silhouette stretching into darkness. Even in ruin, her form commanded respect. The ocean had taken her, but not her majesty. The Bismarck remained sovereign beneath the waves. Outside, the storm began to rise, waves hammering the hull of Connaught, as if the sea itself protested the intrusion. Rain lashed against the deck, wind whistling through antennae and cables. Yet below, the water remained undisturbed, still and silent, its pressure eternal. The contrast between the chaos above and the calm below was haunting. "We're standing on history," Ballard said quietly, "and history is standing still." The cameras withdrew slowly, their beams fading as the wreck receded into the void. The image grew dim until it was only a silhouette, a faint outline swallowed by shadow. The screen turned black, but the silence in the room held a power greater than sound. Men who had fought wars of science stood in reverence before a monument of war itself. Above the storm, the ocean roared. Below it, the dead slept undisturbed. The living could only watch and remember. Back in the control room, the team reviewed the footage in near silence. Every frame carried an echo, the groan of collapsing decks, the hiss of steam, the distant thunder of naval guns. The scientists spoke in hushed tones, careful not to disturb what the ocean had preserved. The Bismarck, they realized, was not just a wreck. She was testimony suspended between history and eternity. Her hull bore no arrogance now, only endurance. Time had turned steel into scripture, each scar a line of remembrance written in rust and salt. "We are the first to see her since that day," one technician said. his voice trembling with awe. The weight of that truth settled over the room like gravity. The sea had hidden her for half a century, guarding her from spectacle, from politics, from war. Now under Ballard's watchful eye she had been found again, but never disturbed. The discovery spread across the world within days, stirring headlines and hearts alike. Newspapers carried images of the ghost ship resting on the ocean floor, her outline majestic even in death. To some it was history recovered, to others a grave disturbed. In naval circles, veterans wept quietly, seeing once more the enemy they had faced and respected. "She's still beautiful," one wrote in a letter to the Times, "and still terrible." The footage played on television screens, flickering images of a ship that had outlasted those who sank her. Children watched, hearing for the first time of a battle their grandparents had survived. The Bismarck had returned to memory not through myth, but through truth. The sea had preserved her better than time or story ever could. Even in darkness, she shone, not in glory but in grace. History had kept its promise. As the expedition ended, Culm turned for home, its course steady through the grey Atlantic swell. The coordinates of the wreck were sealed, a pact of respect between man and ocean. On the monitors, the final image remained, the Bismarck's bow, proud against the silt, her guns silent, her nameplate unreadable but immortal. The crew stood quietly, knowing they had touched something sacred without laying hands upon it. Above them, gulls followed the ship, their cries lost to the wind. The sky cleared slowly, the clouds parting to reveal a strip of pale blue below. Below in the darkness, the Bismarck remained unmoved, untouched, eternal. Her story had begun in fire and ended in silence. Now the sea kept her safe, her secrets locked beneath 10,000 feet of pressure. In the deep, she lay unbroken by time, a cathedral of steel and silence. In the dim light of old film reels, Bismarck still gleams, her hull cutting through calm waters, her guns towering against a pale northern sky. The footage crackles with age, yet the ship's form remains immaculate, every line a testament to human precision and pride. Engineers of the Kriegsmarine once spoke of her as perfection in motion, a machine so complete it seemed almost alive. The steel shimmered with a strange kind of reverence, as if it knew it was built to outlast its creators. In shipyards and classrooms, her blueprints are still studied, the curvature of her bow discussed like sculpture. Even now her design inspires both admiration and unease. She was too beautiful for what she was meant to do, one historian says, his voice heavy with contradiction. Every rivet held a paradox, brilliance born for destruction. The ship was more than weapon. She was art enslaved to purpose, and art, history reminds us, cannot choose its own fate. In naval archives across the world, her story is preserved in paper and film, diagrams, correspondence, orders stamped with the cold certainty of command. The records tell of ambition without restraint, of a nation that sought identity through armor and steel. When naval architects first sketched her in the 1930s, they imagined not just a battleship but a resurrection, a defiance of the humiliation of Versailles. Her keel was a political statement, her launch a national performance. Crowds cheered, bands played, flags unfurled. Germany had risen again, and the sea would bear witness. Yet within that celebration was a shadow, a quiet acknowledgement that technology could never cleanse ideology. The ship carried more than guns. She carried history's hunger for dominance. And when she sailed, she carried with her the illusion that power alone could redeem pride. That illusion sank with her, heavy and unforgotten. For the British, Bismarck was both nightmare and necessity, a challenge that forced remembrance of vulnerability. The loss of HMS Hood had shaken the Empire to its core, a wound to its maritime identity as deep as any battlefield defeat. The destruction of Bismarck became a moral act, a symbol of endurance wrapped in retribution. Yet as years passed, the emotions blurred. In naval museums, veterans spoke not of hatred but of respect. Respect for a foe who had fought with discipline and defiance. "She was magnificent," said one British officer, and we all knew it. Their eyes, even decades later, held a strange reverence when the name was spoken. To destroy her had been victory. To remember her was acknowledgement. The sea had no sides. It only demanded courage. And in that Bismarck had fulfilled her destiny, even in defeat. In Germany, her legacy was more complicated. A mirror reflecting both pride and regret. For some, she remained the pinnacle of engineering, a marvel of precision unmatched in her time. For others, she was a relic of hubris, a floating monument to a nation's fatal dream of invincibility. Schoolbooks mention her sparingly, a footnote in a larger tragedy. Yet model builders in quiet basements still craft her form, sanding each plank as though restoring something sacred. Naval historians debate her meaning, weighing courage against consequence, design against destiny. She was perfect, one engineer says, and that was the problem. The name Bismarck carries echoes of empire, uncomfortably grand for a century that learned to distrust grandeur. Even today, her shadow crosses the line between pride and penance. In steel, she had embodied everything a nation wanted to believe, and everything it could not sustain. At maritime museums in London, Hamburg, and Washington, her image stands behind glass. Black and white stills, rusted instruments, fragments recovered from the deep. Visitors move slowly, voices hushed, as if entering a cathedral. Children press their faces to the displays, drawn not by war but by wonder. The model of the Bismarck, lit softly from above, gleams like a memory polished by time. Nearby, photographs of her wreck rest in dim contrast, the same hull, now silent beneath miles of water. The placards speak of displacement, tonnage, and armor, yet the air carries something else entirely. Reverence, perhaps, mixed with an unease that lingers long after leaving the hall. History here is not about victory, but gravity, the weight of human creation, and the silence it leaves behind. Every exhibit is a whisper between past and present, between what mankind can build and what it cannot control. Naval historians still argue about what Bismarck truly represented. Was she the last of the great battleships or the first relic of an obsolete dream? By the time she was built, aircraft carriers already ruled the future, yet the Bismarck embodied a world unwilling to accept it. She was the final song of an old symphony, thunderous, tragic, beautiful. Her sinking marked not just the fall of a ship, but the end of an era when power could be measured in armor and guns. Every plate, every turret was an assertion that control over the sea still meant control over destiny. But technology had outpaced that illusion. When she fell, so too did the age of battleships, replaced by the cold efficiency of aircraft and code. The sea no longer cared for symbols, it cared only for silence. And in silence, Bismarck found immortality. For engineers, she remains a masterpiece of design, a ship whose systems pushed the limits of what human ingenuity could achieve. Her turbines could propel her through waves like a blade through water, her armor angled to deflect destruction itself. Every bolt was a promise of endurance. Yet in her very perfection lay fragility, a machine so advanced that its survival depended on flawless coordination and luck. The rudder jammed by a single torpedo reminded the world that even the greatest creation could be undone by chance. In naval academies, her blueprints are still studied not only as triumph but as warning. The lesson endures: strength alone is not salvation. A single weakness can turn victory into ruin. The engineers who built her sought eternity in steel. They found instead the laws of nature, patient, impartial, absolute. The myth of Bismarck has outlived the men who fought for and against her. Books, films, songs, all have tried to capture the story, to distill it into something human, yet no retelling can match the quiet truth that lies beneath the sea. There, in the cold darkness, the ship exists beyond judgment, beyond politics, beyond the noise of war. To some she is tragedy, to others glory. To all, she is a reminder that human ambition always carries the seed of its own undoing. The ocean, vast and unchanging, remains her witness and her tomb. Every story told about her echoes that truth, that greatness and destruction are twins born of the same desire. The Bismarck does not accuse, she endures, and endurance, perhaps, is the purest legacy of all. Modern visitors to the wreck speak of awe more than sadness. They describe her not as ruin, but as presence, a vast shadow resting in peace, untouched by time's cruelty. The robotic lights that illuminate her hull reveal symmetry, not decay. Even after half a century, her form commands silence from those who behold it. The sea has stripped her of banners, but not of identity. She looks asleep, one explorer said, as if waiting for the world to quiet down before rising again. In that stillness, her myth breathes, not through power but through remembrance. Humanity's creations fade, but its stories endure, rewritten by those who seek meaning in what was lost. Beneath the crushing pressure of the deep, she has achieved what she was built for: permanence. The waves move above her, and time continues, but she does not yield. She is still Bismarck. In the end, her legacy belongs to neither victor nor vanquished. She stands at the meeting point of pride and humility, of mastery and surrender. The ocean holds her as both monument and warning, a relic of an age when men believed they could command the infinite. Historians debate her significance, yet all agree on one truth: she changed how the world viewed the sea and itself. Her name has become shorthand for power, yet her story whispers of consequence. The Bismarck teaches not through victory, but through loss, not through destruction, but endurance. And though her guns are silent, her memory still echoes through generations of sailors, dreamers, and engineers. She was built to dominate the sea, but instead she became part of it. Bismarck was not merely a ship, she was an idea forged from ambition, ended by consequence. The Atlantic stretches endlessly, its surface shifting like liquid glass beneath a pale morning sky. Waves roll with slow majesty, their rhythm unchanged by time, by war, by memory. The wind that once carried the smoke of battle now drifts softly, cool and indifferent, across empty coordinates. Beneath those waters, deeper than sunlight can reach, the Bismarck rests, her hull draped in silt and shadow, her turrets overgrown with coral and pale anemones. Fish glide silently through her broken corridors, darting through doorways that once echoed with orders and shouts. Nature, patient and impartial, has begun its quiet reclamation. Rust blossoms like moss, steel has softened into sculpture, and destruction has become beauty in slow motion. The sea does not mourn, nor does it celebrate. It simply endures, transforming violence into stillness. What was once thunder is now peace. On the seafloor, the light from a remote submersible moves like a prayer candle in a vast cathedral. Particles drift through its beam, turning the water into a snow of forgotten time. The camera glides past a fallen gun barrel, its muzzle buried in the sand, its surface alive with barnacles. Every contour of the ship bears witness, but none give judgment. Her decks are carpeted in fine sediment that shifts with the current as if breathing. No sound penetrates here. Not the crash of waves, not the hum of engines, only the eternal pulse of the ocean itself. Tiny crabs scuttle over insignias once burnished with pride. A twisted railing holds fast against the slow collapse of centuries. Life has returned, but in forms too small to comprehend the story beneath them. Even in ruin she shelters life, and perhaps that is her quiet redemption. Above, the Atlantic swells rise and fall, their motion as ancient as breath. The same waters that drowned her now cradle her remains with a strange tenderness. Ships still cross these latitudes, their engines vibrating faintly through the depths, unaware of the monument below. The sea has erased the scars of battle from its surface, leaving only distance and reflection. Somewhere, a gull drifts on an updraft, its cry the only sound across the endless grey. To those who know the story, this place is sacred, not for victory, but for remembrance. On calm days, the horizon is so smooth it feels like glass, as if history itself were reflected there. Beneath that mirror lies silence too deep for words. The ocean has no memory of nations, only of echoes, and echoes, it seems, never fade completely. Each year, ships pass over the coordinates, their captains marking the moment with quiet respect. Wreaths are cast into the sea, circles of colour resting briefly on the surface before sinking slowly into the cold embrace below. The flowers drift downward, their petals curling as they fall through layers of darkness. Some are caught in the current, carried miles away. Others settle softly onto the ship's hull where coral has replaced paint. The gesture is small, but it binds generations to the same story of courage, of error, or of human frailty. The ocean receives them all without distinction. No ceremony here lasts long. The sea allows only brief intrusions before reclaiming its stillness. Yet even fleeting remembrance leaves a trace. In that gesture, humanity touches eternity. The sea, indifferent but infinite, remembers for those who cannot. In coastal museums, the echoes of that remembrance continue in whispers and glass displays. Visitors move slowly between models, photographs, and letters, their footsteps muffled by carpet and reverence. A single bell from the Bismarck hangs suspended in a shaft of light, its bronze dulled by salt and age. Children look up, wide-eyed, while veterans stare through it, seeing something far beyond its metal surface. The air smells faintly of varnish and dust, of history preserved rather than lived. Somewhere, a recording of waves plays softly through hidden speakers, the sound blending memory with imagination. The curators speak of technology and tactics, but what lingers is silence. Every artifact holds an echo, not of triumph, but of consequence. Time, like the tide, smooths all edges, and in that stillness, reverence becomes the truest form of remembrance. Far below, the wreck endures not as ruin, but as transformation. Her hull, fractured and scarred, has become a reef. Her decks a landscape of colour and motion. Anemones bloom where fire once raged. Tiny schools of fish weave through open hatches, their movements graceful as the turn of planets. The pressure down here is crushing, yet the ship stands unbowed, her spirit somehow intact within the stillness. The sea has made her part of its architecture, another cathedral built by time itself. The metal hums faintly under the strain of depth, a whisper heard only by instruments and imagination. Every current that brushes her hull carries a trace of memory. Even in darkness, she glows faintly beneath the searchlights of the deep. She no longer belongs to man, she belongs to the ocean. On the surface, weather changes as swiftly as thought. Storms roll through, their thunder echoing across empty miles, reminding all who listen that nature, not empire, is the final power. Lightning flashes, illuminating the waves like the flicker of old gunfire, and for an instant it feels as though the battle returns. But the illusion fades as quickly as it forms. Rain falls softly after the fury, flattening the sea into calm, its rhythm steady and eternal. Somewhere beneath, the Bismarck remains unmoved, her story unaltered by the tempests above. Time itself seems slower here, stretched thin between memory and myth. To those who come to remember, the sea feels almost alive, sentient in its patience, endless in its grace. The waves roll on, but they never forget. The Atlantic, indifferent yet infinite, carries all names equally in its depths. The story of the Bismarck has become part of something larger than war. It is no longer about strategy or machinery, but about the fragile threads that bind memory to meaning. Her name speaks not of destruction now, but of endurance, the kind found in the human need to remember, to learn, to reconcile. The sea with its eternal rhythm teaches that everything returns to balance. Pride becomes humility. Fire becomes silence. Even the greatest machines are reduced to stillness, and stillness becomes peace. Historians will continue to debate her purpose. Poets will continue to imagine her soul, but the truth rests below, unchanged and absolute. In the end, nature writes the final chapter of every human story, in wind, in water, in time. Above the wreck, the ocean is alive again with color and motion. Sunlight dances on the surface, fractured by waves that once carried fleets into war. The sky is endless, the air sharp with salt and distance. Seabirds wheel overhead, their cries mingling with the hiss of foam against steel. From above there is no sign of what lies beneath, only the quiet, patient surface of the world's oldest witness. The Atlantic keeps its secrets well, but in its silence there is neither triumph nor loss, only balance. Every sound, every wave, every reflection carries a trace of what once was. The sea remembers, not in anger but in rhythm. It turns death into memory, memory into stillness, and stillness into life. In its vastness, nothing is truly gone. When the cameras shut off and the ships turn home, the ocean closes again, seamless and whole. No monument marks the place, no flag breaks the horizon, only the deep rolling pulse of the planet itself. Beneath those endless waves lies a chapter of human history written in steel and silence. The Bismarck rests not as ruin but as reminder that all power, no matter how vast, returns to quiet. The sea needs no witnesses, it carries them all within. Storms will come and pass, but her story will remain unspoken yet unforgotten. For the ocean has no memory of victory, only of echoes. Its walls of water bear witness without bias, its currents murmuring truths too deep for words. The sea keeps no grudges, only echoes. The walls of water remember, and within their silence history sleeps.